Cassette number 1, side 1 of An American Tragedy, Part 2, by Theodore Dreiser, narrated by Flo Gibson for Classic Books on Cassettes, in the studios of Audiobook Contractors Incorporated. Copyright 2000. Chapter 46. And then at noon on Tuesday, July 6th, the station platform of the railroad running from Fonda to Utica, with Roberta stepping down from the train which came south from Bouts to await Clyde, for the train that was to take them to Utica was not due for another half-hour. And 15 minutes later, Clyde himself, coming from a side street and approaching the station from the south, from which position Roberta could not see him, but from where, after turning the west corner of the depot and stationing himself behind a pile of crates, he could see her. How thin and pale indeed! By contrast with Sandra, how illy dressed in the blue traveling suit and small brown hat with which she had equipped herself for this occasion. The promise of a restricted and difficult life as contrasted with that offered by Sandra. And she was thinking of compelling him to give up Sandra in order to marry her, and from which union he might never be able to extricate himself until such time as would make Sandra and all she represented a mere recollection. The difference between the attitudes of these two girls, Sandra with everything offering all, asking nothing of him, Roberta with nothing, asking all. A feeling of dark and bitter resentment swept over him, and he could not help but feel sympathetic toward that unknown man at Pass Lake, and secretly wish that he'd been successful. Perhaps he, too, had been confronted by a situation just like this, and perhaps he'd done right, too, after all, and that was why it had not been found out. His nerves twitched. His eyes were somber, resentful, and yet nervous. Could it not happen again successfully in this case? But here he was now upon the same platform with her as a result of her persistent and illogical demands, and he must be thinking how, and boldly, he must carry out the plans which for 4 days, or ever since he telephoned her, and in a dimmer way for the 10 preceding those, he'd been planning. This settled course must not be interfered with now. He must act. He must not let fear influence him to anything less than he'd now planned. And so it was that he now stepped forth in order that she might see him, at the same time giving her a wise and seemingly friendly and informative look, as if to say, "You see, I'm here." But behind the look, if only she could have pierced beneath the surface and sensed that dark and tortured mood, how speedily she would have fled. But now, seeing him actually present, a heavy shadow that was lurking in her eyes lifted. The somewhat downturned corners of her mouth reversed themselves, and without appearing to recognize him, she nevertheless brightened, and at once proceeded to the window to purchase her ticket to Utica, as he had instructed her to do. And she was now thinking that at last he'd come, and he was going to take her away, and hence a kind of gratefulness for this welling up in her. For they were to be together for 7 or 8 months at least, and while it might take tact and patience to adjust things, still it might and probably could be done. From now on she must be the very soul of caution, not do or say anything that would irritate him in any way, since naturally he would not be in the best mood because of this. But he must have changed some. Perhaps he was seeing her in a more kindly light, sympathizing with her a little, since he now appeared at last to have most gracefully and genially succumbed to the unavoidable, and at the same time noting his light gray suit, his new straw hat, his brightly polished shoes, and the dark tan suitcase, and, strange, equivocal, frivolous erraticism of his in this instance, the tripod of a recently purchased camera, together with his tennis racket and its canvas case strapped to the side, more than anything to conceal the initials C.G., she was seized with much of her old-time mood and desire in regard to his looks and temperament. He was still, and despite his present indifference to her Clyde. Having seen her secure a ticket, he now went to get his own, and then, with another knowing look in her direction, which said that everything was now all right, he returned to the eastern end of the platform, while she returned to her position at the forward end. Why was that old man in that old brown winter suit and hat, and carrying that birdcage in a brown paper, looking at him so? Could he sense anything? Did he know him? Had he ever worked in Lycurgus or seen him before? He was going to buy a second straw hat in Utica today. He must remember that. A straw hat with a Utica label, which he would wear instead of his present one. Then, when she was not looking, he would put the old one in his bag with his other things. That was why he would have to leave her for a little while after they reached Utica, at the depot or library or somewhere. Perhaps, as was his first plan, take her to some small hotel somewhere and register as Mr. and Mrs. Carl Graham, or Clifford Golden, or Gehring. There was a girl in the factory by that name, so if they were ever traced in any way, it would be assumed that she'd gone away with some man of that name. That whistle of a train far off. It must be coming now. His watch said 12:27. And again he must decide what his manner toward her in Utica must be, whether very cordial or the opposite. For over the telephone, of course, he had talked very soft and genial-like because he had to. Perhaps it would be best to keep that up. Otherwise she might become angry or suspicious or stubborn, and that would make it hard. Would that train never get here? At the same time, it was going to be very hard on him to be so very pleasant when, after all, she was driving him as she was, expecting him to do all that she was asking him to do, and yet be nice to her. Damn! And yet, if he weren't... Supposing she should sense something of his thoughts in connection with this, really refuse to go through with it this way and spoil his plans. If only his knees and hands wouldn't tremble so at times. But no, how was she able to detect anything of that kind, when he himself had not quite made up his mind as to whether he would be able to go through with it or not? He only knew he was not going away with her, and that was all there was to that. He might not upset the boat, as he decided on the day before, but just the same, he was not going away with her. But here now was the train, and there was Roberta lifting her bag. Was it too heavy for her in her present state? It probably was. Well, too bad. It was very hot today, too. At any rate, he would help her with it later, when they were where no one could see them. She was looking toward him to be sure he was getting on. So like her these days, in her suspicious, doubtful mood in regard to him. But here was a seat in the rear of the car on the shady side, too. That was not so bad. He would settle himself comfortably and look out. For just outside Fonda, a mile or two beyond, was that same Mohawk that ran through Lycurgus and past the factory, and along the banks of which the year before he and Roberta had walked about this time. But the memory of that being far from pleasant now, he turned his eyes to a paper he'd bought, and behind which he could shield himself as much as possible, while he once more began to observe the details of the more inward scene which now so much more concerned him, the nature of the lake country around Big Bittern, which ever since that final important conversation with Roberta over the telephone had been interesting him more than any other geography of the world. For on Friday, after the conversation, he had stopped in at the Lycurgus house and secured 3 different folders relating to hotels, lodges, inns, and other camps in the more remote region beyond Big Bittern and Long Lake. If only there was some way to get to one of those completely deserted lakes described by that guide at Big Bittern. Only perhaps there might not be any rowboats on any of these lakes at all. And again on Saturday, had he not secured 4 more circulars from the rack at the depot? They were in his pocket now. Had they not proved how many small lakes and inns there were along this same railroad, which ran north to Big Bittern, to which he and Roberta might resort for a day or two if she would? A night, anyhow, before going to Big Bittern and Grass Lake. Had he not noted that in particular, a beautiful lake, it had said, near the station, and with at least 3 attractive lodges or country home inns, where 2 could stay for as low as $20 a week. That meant that 2 could stay for one night, surely for as little as $5. It must be so, surely. And so he was going to say to her, as he'd already planned these several days, that she needed a little rest before going away to a strange place, that it would not cost very much, about $15 for fares and all. So the circular said, if they went to Grass Lake for a night, this same night after reaching Utica, or on the morrow, anyhow. And he would have to picture it all to her as a sort of honeymoon journey, a little pleasant outing before getting married. And it would not do to succumb to any plan of hers to get married before they did this. That would never do. Those 5 birds winging toward that patch of trees over there, below that hill. It certainly would not do to go direct to Big Bittern from Utica for a boat ride, just one day, 70 miles. That would not sound right to her, or to anyone. It would make her suspicious, maybe. It might be better, since he would have to get away from her to buy a hat in Utica, to spend this first night there at some inexpensive, inconspicuous hotel, and once there suggest going up to Grass Lake. And from there they could go to Big Bittern in the morning. He could say that Big Bittern was nicer, or that they would go down to 3 Mile Bay, a hamlet really as he knew, where they could be married, but en route stop at Big Bittern as a sort of lark. He would say that he wanted to show her the lake, take some pictures of her and himself. He had brought his camera for that, and for other pictures of Sondra later. The blackness of this plot of his, those 9 black and white cows on that green hillside. But again, strapping that tripod, along with his tennis racket, to the side of his suitcase, might not that cause people to imagine that they were passing tourists from some distant point, maybe? And if they both disappeared, well then, they were not people from anywhere around here, were they? Didn't the guide say that the water in the lake was all of 75 feet deep, like that water at Pass Lake? And as for Roberta's grip, oh yes, what about that? He hadn't even thought about that as yet, really. Those 3 automobiles out there, running almost as fast as this train. Well, in coming down from Grass Lake after one night there, he could say that he was going to marry her at 3 Mile Bay at the north end of Gray's Lake, where a minister lived whom he'd met. He would induce her to leave her bag at that Gun Lodge station, where they took the bus over to Big Bittern, while he took his with him. He could just say to someone, the boatman maybe, or the driver, that he was taking his camera in his bag, and ask where the best views were. Or maybe a lunch. Was that not a better idea? To take a lunch, and so deceive Roberta too, perhaps? And that would tend to mislead the driver also, would it not? People did carry cameras in bags when they went out on lakes at times. At any rate, it was most necessary for him to carry his bag in this instance, else why the plan to go south to that island, and from thence through the woods? Oh, the grimness and the terror of this plan! Could he really execute it? But that strange cry of that bird at Big Bittern, he'd not like that, or seeing that guide up there who might remember him now. He had not talked to him at all, had not even gotten out of the car, but had only looked out at him through the window, and in so far as he could recall, the guide had not even once looked at him, had merely talked to Grant Cranston and Harley Baggett, who'd gotten out and had done all the talking. But supposing this guide should be there and remember him, but how could that be when he really had not seen him? This guide would probably not remember him at all, might not even be there. But why should his hands and face be damp all the time now, wet almost and cold, his knees shaky? The train was following the exact curve of the stream, and last summer he and Roberta. But no. As soon as they reached Utica now, this was the way he would do, and must keep it well in mind and not get rattled in any way. He must not. He must not. He must let her walk up the street before him, say 100 feet or so between them, so that no one would think he was following her, of course. And then, when they were quite alone somewhere, he would catch up with her and explain all about this. Be very nice, as though he cared for her as much as ever now. He would have to, if he were to get her to do as he wanted. And then, oh yes, have her wait while he went for that extra straw hat that he was going to, well, leave on the water, maybe. And the oars, too, of course. And her hat and, well, the long, sad-sounding whistle of this train. Damn, he was getting nervous already. But before going to the hotel, he must go back to the depot and put his new hat in the bag, or better yet, carry it while he looked for the sort of hotel he wanted, and then before going to Roberta, take the hat and put it in his bag. Then he would go and find her and have her come to the entrance of the hotel he'd found and wait for him while he got the bags. And, of course, if there was no one around, or very few, they would enter together, only she could wait in the ladies' parlor somewhere while he went and registered as Charles Golden, maybe, this time. And then, well, in the morning, if she agreed, or tonight, for that matter, If there were any trains, he would have to find out about that. They could go up to Grass Lake in separate cars until they were past 12th Lake and Sharon at any rate. The beautiful Cranston Lodge there, and Sondra. And then, that big red barn, and that small white house near it, and that windmill, so like those houses and barns that he'd seen out there in Illinois and Missouri, and Chicago, too. And at the same time, Roberta in her car forward, thinking that Clyde had not appeared so very unfriendly to her. To be sure, it was hard on him, making him leave Lycurgus in this way, and when he might be enjoying himself as he wished to. But on the other hand, here she was, and there was no other way for her to be. She must be very genial, and yet not put herself forward too much or in his way. And yet she must not be too receding or weak either, for after all, Clyde was the one who'd placed her in this position, and it was only fair and little enough for him to do. She would have a baby to look after in the future, and all that trouble to go through with from now on, and later she would have to explain to her parents this whole mysterious proceeding, which covered her present disappearance and marriage, if Clyde really did marry her now. But she must insist upon that, and soon, in Utica perhaps, certainly at the very next place they went to, and get a copy of her marriage certificate, too, and keep it for her own as well as the baby's sake. He could get a divorce as he pleased after that. She would still be Mrs. Griffiths, and Clyde's baby and hers would be a Griffiths, too. That was something. How beautiful the little river was. It reminded her of the Mohawk, and the walk she and he had taken last summer when they first met. Oh, last summer. And now this. And they would settle somewhere, in 1 or 2 rooms, no doubt. Where, she wondered, in what town or city? How far away from Lycurgus or Bouts? The farther from Bouts, the better, although she should like to see her mother and father again, and soon as she safely could. But what matter, as long as they were going away together and she was to be married? Had he noticed her blue suit and little brown hat? And had he thought she looked at all attractive, compared to those rich girls with whom he was always running? She must be very tactful, not irritate him in any way. But oh, the happy life they could have if only he cared for her a little, just a little. And then Utica, and on a quiet street, Clyde catching up with Roberta, his expression a mixture of innocent geniality and goodwill, tempered by worry and opposition, which was really a mask for the fear of the deed that he himself was contemplating, his power to execute it, the consequences in case he failed. Chapter 47. And then, as planned that night between them, a trip to Grass Lake the next morning in separate cars, but which, upon their arrival and to his surprise, proved to be so much more briskly tenanted than he anticipated. He was very much disturbed and frightened by the evidence of so much active life up here, for he had fancied this, as well as Big Bittern, would be all but deserted. Yet here now, as both could see, it was the summer seat and gathering place of some small religious organization or group, the Wineburnerians of Pennsylvania, as it proved, with a tabernacle and numerous cottages across the lake from the station. And Roberta at once exclaiming, "Now there, isn't that cute? Why couldn't we be married over there by the minister of that church?" And Clyde, puzzled and shaken by this sudden and highly unsatisfactory development, at once announced, "Why, sure, I'll go over after a bit and see." Yet his mind busy with schemes for circumventing her. He would take her out in a boat after registering and getting settled, and remain too long, or should a peculiarly remote and unobserved spot be found. But no, there were too many people here. The lake was not large enough, and probably not very deep. It was black or dark like tar, and sentinelled to the east and north by tall dark pines, the serried spears of armed and watchful giants, as they now seemed to him, ogres almost. So gloomy, suspicious, and fantastically erratic was his own mood in regard to all this. But still there were too many people, as many as 10 on the lake. The weirdness of it, the difficulty. But whisper, one could not walk from here through any woods to 3 Mile Bay. Oh, no, that was all of 30 miles to the south now. And besides, this lake was less lonely, probably continually observed by members of this religious group. Oh, no, He must say, but what could he say? That he had inquired, and that no license could be procured here, or that the minister was away, or that he required certain identifications which he did not have, or, well, anything that would serve to still Roberta until such hour tomorrow as the train south from here left for Big Bittern and Sharon, where of course they would surely be married. Why should she be so insistent? And why, anyhow, and except for her crass determination to force him in this way, should he be compelled to track here and there with her, every hour, every minute of which was torture, an unending mental crucifixion, really, when, if he were but rid of her? Oh, Sandra, Sandra, if but now from your high estate you might bend down and aid me. No more lies, no more suffering, no more misery of any kind. But instead more lies, a long and aimless and pestilential search for water-lilies, which, because of his own restless mood, bored Roberta as much as it did him. Of why, she was now thinking to herself as they rode about, this indifference to this marriage possibility, which could have been arranged before now and given this outing the dream quality it would and should have had, if only he had arranged for everything in Utica, even as she had wanted. But this waiting, evasion, and so like Clyde, his vacillating, indefinite, uncertain mood always. She was beginning to wonder now as to his intentions again, whether really and truly he did intend to marry her as he'd promised. Tomorrow or the next day at most would show, so why worry now? And then the next day at noon, Gun Lodge and Big Bittern itself, and Clyde climbing down from the train at Gun Lodge and escorting Roberta to the waiting bus, the while he assured her that since they were coming back this way, it would be best if she were to leave her bag here, while he, because of his camera as well as the lunch done up at Grass Lake and crowded into a suitcase, would take his own with him, because they would lunch on the lake. But on reaching the bus, he was dismayed by the fact that the driver was the same guide whom he heard talk at Big Bittern. What if it should prove now that this guide had seen and remembered him? Would he not at least recall the handsome Finchley car, Bertine and Stewart on the front seat, himself and Sandra at the back, Grant and that Harley Baggett talking to him outside? At once that cold perspiration that had marked his more nervous and terrified moods for weeks past now burst forth on his face and hands. Of what had he been thinking, anyhow? How planning? In God's name, how expect to carry a thing like this through, if he were going to think so poorly? It was like his failing to wear his cap from Lycurgus to Utica, or at least getting it out of his bag before he tried to buy that straw hat. It was like not buying the straw hat before he went to Utica at all. Yet the guide did not remember him, thank God. On the contrary, he inquired rather curiously, and as of a total stranger, "Going over to the lodge at Big Bittern? First time up here?" And Clyde, enormously relieved and yet really tremulous, replied, "Yes," and then in his nervous excitement asked, "Many people over there today?" A question which, the moment he had propounded it, seemed almost insane. Why, of all questions, should he ask that? Oh, God, would his silly, self-destructive mistakes never cease? So troubled was he indeed now that he scarcely heard the guide's reply, or if at all, as a voice speaking from a long way off. "Not so many. About 7 or 8, I guess. We did have about 30 over the 4th, but most of them went down yesterday." The stillness of these pines lining this damp yellow road along which they were traveling, the cool and the silence, the dark shadows and purple and gray depths and nooks in them, even at high noon. If one were slipping away at night or by day, who would encounter one here? A blue jay far in the depths somewhere uttered its metallic shriek. A field sparrow, tremulous upon some distant twig, filled the silver shadows with its perfect song. And Roberta, as this heavy covered bus crossed rill and thin stream, and then rough wooden bridges here and there, commented on the clarity and sparkle of the water. "Isn't that wonderful in there? Do you hear the tinkling of that water, Clyde? Oh, the freshness of this air!" And yet she was going to die so soon. God! But supposing now at Big Bittern, the lodge and boathouse there were many people, or that the lake, peradventure, was literally dotted with those that were there, All fishermen and all fishing here and there, each one separate and alone, no privacy or a deserted spot anywhere. And how strange he'd not thought of that. The lake was probably not nearly as deserted as he'd imagined, or would not be today, any more than Grass Lake had proved. And then what? Well, flight then, flight, and let it go at that. This strain was too much. Hell, he would die thinking thoughts like these. How could he have dreamed to better his fortunes by any so wild and brutal a scheme as this, anyhow? To kill and then run away, or rather to kill and pretend that he and she had drowned, while he, the real murderer, slipped away to life and happiness. What a horrible plan! And yet how else? How? Had he not come all this way to do this? And was he going to turn back now? And all this time Roberta at his side was imagining that she was not going to anything but marriage. Tomorrow morning, sure. And now only to the passing pleasure of seeing this beautiful lake of which he'd been talking, as though it were something more important and delectable than any that had as yet been in her life, or his life for that matter. But now the guide was speaking again, and to him. "You're not minding to stay over, I suppose? I see you left the young lady's bag over there." He nodded in the direction of Gun Lodge. "No, we're going on down tonight, on that 8:10. You take people over to that?" "Oh, sure." "They said you did, at Grass Lake." But now why should he have added that reference to Grass Lake? For that showed that he and Roberta had been there before coming here. But this fool, with his reference to the young lady's bag, and leaving it at Gun Lodge, the devil! Why shouldn't he mind his own business? Or why should he have decided that he and Roberta were not married? Or had he so decided? At any rate, why such a question when they were carrying 2 bags and he'd brought 1? Strange. The effrontery. How should he know or guess or what? But what harm could it do, married or unmarried? If she were not found, married or unmarried would make no difference, would it? And if she were, and it was discovered that she was not married, would that not prove that she was off with someone else? Of course. So why worry over that now? And Roberta asking, "Are there any hotels or boarding houses on the lake besides this one we're going to?" "Not a one, miss, outside of the inn that we're going to. There was a crowd of young fellers and girls camping over on the east shore yesterday, I believe, about a mile from the inn. But whether they're there now or not, I don't know. Ain't seen none of them today." A crowd of young fellows and girls, for God's sake! And might not they now be out on the water, all of them, rowing or sailing, or what? And he here with her. Maybe some of them from 12th Lake, just as he and Sandra and Harriet and Stuart and Bertine had come up 2 weeks before. Some of them friends of the Cranstons, Harriet's, Finchleys, or others who'd come up here to play, and who would remember him, of course. And again, then, there must be a road to the east of this lake, and all this knowledge and their presence there now might make this trip of his useless. Such silly plotting, such pointless planning as this, when at least he might have taken more time, chosen a lake still farther away, and should have. Only so tortured had he been for these last many days that he could scarcely think how to think. Well, all he could do now was to go and see. If there were many, he must think of some way to row to some real lonely spot, or maybe turn and return to Grass Lake, or where? Oh, what could or would he do, if there were many over here? But just then, along an aisle of green trees giving out at the far end, as he now recalled, upon a square lawn, and the lake itself, the little inn with its pillared veranda facing the dark blue waters of Big Bittern, and that low, small, red-roofed boathouse to the right on the water that he'd seen before when he was here, and Roberta exclaiming on sight, "Oh, it is pretty, isn't it? Just beautiful!" And Clyde surveying that dark, low island in the distance to the south, and seeing but few people about, none on the lake itself, exclaiming nervously, "Yes, it is, you bet," but feeling half-choked as he said it. And now the host of the inn himself appearing and approaching, a medium-sized, red-faced, broad-shouldered man who was saying most intriguingly, "Staying over for a few days." But Clyde, irritated by this new development, and after paying the guide $1, replying crustily and irritably, No, just came over for the afternoon. We're going on down tonight. You'll be staying over for dinner then, I suppose. The train doesn't leave till 8:15. Oh, yes, that's so. Sure. Yes, well, in that case we will. For, of course, Roberta, on her honeymoon, the day before her wedding, and on a trip like this, would be expecting her dinner. Damn this stocky, red-faced fool anyway. Well, then, I'll just take your bag and you can register. Your wife will probably be wanting to freshen up a bit anyway. He led the way, bag in hand, although Clyde's greatest desire was to snatch it from him, for he had not expected to register here, nor leave his bag either, and would not. He would recapture it and hire a boat, but on top of that, being compelled for the register's sake, as Boniface phrased it, to sign Clifford Golden and his wife before he could take his bag again, and then to add to the nervousness and confusion engendered by all this, thoughts as to what additional developments or persons even he might encounter before leaving on his climacteric errand. Roberta announcing that because of the heat and the fact that they were coming back to dinner, she would leave her hat and coat, a hat in which he'd already seen the label of Braunstein in Lycurgus, and which at the time caused him to meditate as to the wisdom of leaving or extracting it. But he had decided that perhaps afterwards, if he should really do this, it might not make any difference whether it was there or not. Was she not likely to be identified anyhow, if found, and if not found, who was to know who she was? In a confused and turbulent state mentally, scarcely realizing the clarity or import of any particular thought or movement or act now, he took up his bag and led the way to the boathouse platform, and then, after dropping the bag into the boat, asking of the boathouse keeper if he knew where the best views were, that he wanted to photograph them, and this done, the meaningless explanation over, assisting Roberta, an almost nebulous figure she now seemed, stepping down into an insubstantial rowboat upon a purely ideational lake, he now stepped in after her, seating himself in the center and taking the oars. The quiet, glassy, iridescent surface of this lake that now to both seemed not so much like water as oil, like molten glass that of enormous bulk and weight, resting upon the substantial earth so very far below, and the lightness and freshness and intoxication of the gentle air blowing here and there, yet scarcely rippling the surface of the lake, and the softness and furry thickness of the tall pines about the shore, everywhere pines, tall and spear-like, and above them the humped backs of the dark and distant Adirondacks beyond. Not a rower to be seen, not a house or cabin. He sought to distinguish the camp of which the guide had spoken. He could not. He sought to distinguish the voices of those who might be there, or any voices. Yet except for the lock of his own oars as he rowed, and the voice of the boathouse keeper and the guide in converse 200, 300, 500, 1,000 feet behind, there was no sound. "Isn't it still and peaceful?" It was Roberta talking. "It seems to be so restful here. I think it's beautiful, truly, so much more beautiful than that other lake. These trees are so tall, aren't they? And those mountains. I was thinking all the way over how cool and silent that road was, even if it was a little rough." "Did you talk to anyone in the inn there just now?" "Why, no. What makes you ask?" "Oh, I thought you might have run into someone. There don't seem to be very many people up here today, though, does there?" "No, I don't see anyone on the lake. I saw 2 men in that billiard room at the back there, and there was a girl in the ladies' room, that was all." "Isn't this water cold?" She'd put her hand over the side, and was trailing it in the blue-black ripples made by his oars. "Is it? I haven't felt it yet." He paused in his rowing and put out his hand, then resumed. He would not row directly to that island to the south. It was too far, too early. She might think it odd. Better a little delay, a little time in which to think, a little while in which to reconnoiter. Roberta would be wanting to eat her lunch, and there was a charming-looking point of land there to the west about a mile further on. They could go there and eat first, or she could, for he would not be eating today, and then... She was looking at the very same point of land that he was, a curved horn of land that bent to the south, and yet reached quite far out into the water and combed with tall pines. And now she added, "Have you any spot in mind, dear, where we could stop and eat? I'm getting a little hungry, aren't you?" If she'd only not call him dear, here and now. The little inn and the boathouse to the north were growing momentarily smaller, looking now like that other boathouse and pavilion on Crum Lake the day he'd first rowed there, and when he'd been wishing that he might come to such a lake as this in the Adirondacks, dreaming of such a lake, and wishing to meet such a girl as Roberta then. And overhead was one of those identical woolly clouds that had sailed above him at Crum Lake on that fateful day. The horror of this effort! They might look for water lilies here today, to kill time a little before... To kill time. To kill. God! He must quit thinking of that, if he were going to do it at all. He needn't be thinking of it now, at any rate. At the point of land favored by Roberta, into a minute protected bay with a small curved honey-colored beach and safe from all prying eyes north or east. And then he and she stepping out normally enough, and Roberta, after Clyde had extracted the lunch most cautiously from his bag, spreading it on a newspaper on the shore, while he walked here and there, making strange and yet admiring comments on the beauty of the scene, the pines and the curve of the small bay, yet thinking of the island farther on, and the bay below that again somewhere, where somehow, and in the face of a weakening courage for it, he must still execute this grim and terrible business before him, not allow this carefully planned opportunity to go for nothing, if he were to not really run away and leave all that he most desired to keep. And yet the horror of this business and the danger, now that it was so close at hand, the danger of making a mistake of some kind, if nothing more, of not upsetting the boat right, of not being able to, oh God, and subsequently, maybe, to be proved to be what he would be then, a murderer, arrested, tried. He could not, he would not go through with it. No, no, no. And yet Roberta sitting here with him now on the sand, feeling quite at peace with all the world as he could see. And she was beginning to hum a little, and then to make advisory and practical references to the nature of their coming adventure together, their material and financial state from now on, how and where they would go from here, Syracuse most likely, since Clyde seemed to have no objection to that, and what, once there, they would do. Roberta had heard from her brother-in-law, Fred Gable, of a new collar and shirt factory that was just starting up in Syracuse. Might it not be possible for Clyde, for the time being at least, to get himself a position with that firm at once? And then later, when her own worst trouble was over, might not she connect herself with the same company or some other? And temporarily, since they had so little money, could they not take a small room together, somewhere in some family home? Or if he did not like that, since they were by no means so close temperamentally as they once had been, then 2 small adjoining rooms, maybe. She could still feel his unrelenting opposition under all this present show of courtesy and consideration. And he thinking, oh, well, what difference such talk now? And whether he agreed or whether he did not, what difference, since he was not going, or she either, that way? Great God! But here he was talking as though tomorrow she would be here still, and she would not be. If only his knees would not tremble so, his hands and face and body continue so damp. And after that, farther on down, the west shore of the small lake in this little boat to that island, with Clyde looking nervously and wearily here and there to see that there was no one, not anywhere in sight on land or water, no one. It was so still and deserted here, thank God. Here or anywhere near here might do, really, if only he had the courage so to do now, which he had not, yet. Roberta trailing her hand in the water, asking him if he thought they might find some water lilies or wildflowers somewhere on shore. Water lilies, wildflowers, and he convincing himself as he went that there were no roads, cabins, tents, paths, anything in the form of a habitation among these tall, close-ranking pines, no trace of any little boat on the widespread surface of this beautiful lake on this beautiful day. Yet might there not be some lone, solitary hunter and trapper or guide or fisherman in these woods or along these banks? Might there not be? And supposing there were one here now somewhere, and watching. Fate, destruction, death. Yet no sound and no smoke. Only these tall, dark green pines, spear-shaped and still, with here and there a dead one, ashen pale in the hard afternoon sun, its gaunt, sapless arms almost menacingly outstretched. Death! And the sharp metallic cry of a blue jay speeding in the depths of these woods, or the lone and ghostly tap, tap, tap of some solitary woodpecker, with now and then the red line of a flying tanager, the yellow and black of a yellow-shouldered blackbird. Oh, the sun shines bright in my old Kentucky home. It was Roberta singing cheerfully, one hand in the deep blue water. And then a little later, I'll be there Sunday if you will, one of the popular dance pieces of the day. And then at last, after fully an hour of rowing, brooding, singing, stopping to look at some charming point of land, reconnoitering some receding inlet which promised water lilies, and with Roberta already saying that they must watch the time and not stay out too long, the bay south of the island itself, a beautiful, and yet most funereally pine-encircled and land-delimited bit of water, more like a smaller lake, connected by an inlet or passage to the larger one, and yet itself a respectable body of water of perhaps 20 acres of surface and almost circular in form. The manner in which to the east, the north, the south, the west even, except for the passage by which the island to the north of it was separated from the mainland, this pool or tarn was encircled by trees, and cattails and water lilies here and there, a few along its shores, and somehow suggesting an especially arranged pool or tarn to which one who was weary of life and cares, anxious to be away from the strife and contentions of the world, might most wisely and yet gloomily repair. And as they glided into this still dark water seemed to grip Clyde as nothing here or anywhere before this ever had, to change his mood. For once here he seemed to be fairly pulled or lured along into it, and having encircled its quiet banks, to be drifting in endless space, where was no end of anything, no plots, no plans, no practical problems to be solved, nothing. The insidious beauty of this place. Truly it seemed to mock him, this strangeness, this dark pool, surrounded on all sides by those wonderful soft fir trees, and the water itself looking like a huge black pearl cast by some mighty hand, in anger possibly, in sport or fantasy maybe, into the bosom of this valley of dark green plush, and which seemed bottomless as he gazed into it. And yet what did it all suggest so strongly? Death! Death! More definitely than anything he'd ever seen before. Death! But also a still, quiet, unprotesting type of death, into which one, by reason of choice or hypnosis or unutterable weariness, might joyfully and gratefully sink. So quiet, so shaded, so serene. Even Roberta exclaimed over this, and he now felt for the first time the grip of some seemingly strong and yet friendly, sympathetic hands laid firmly on his shoulders. The comfort of them, the warmth, the strength. For now they seemed to have a steadying effect on him, and he liked them, their reassurance, their support. If only they would not be removed. If only they would remain always the hands of this friend. For where had he ever known this comforting and almost tender sensation before in all his life? Not anywhere. And somehow this calmed him, and he seemed to slip away from the reality of all things. To be sure, there was Roberta over there, but by now she had faded to a shadow or thought really, a form of illusion more vaporous than real. And while there was something about her in color, form, that suggested reality, still she was very insubstantial, so very, and once more now he felt strangely alone. For the hands of the friend of firm grip had vanished also, and Clyde was alone, so very much alone and forlorn in this somber, beautiful realm to which apparently he had been led and then deserted. Also he felt strangely cold, the spell of this strange beauty overwhelming him with a kind of chill. He had come here for what? And he must do what? Kill Roberta? Oh, no. and again he lowered his head and gazed into the fascinating yet treacherous depths of that magnetic, bluish-purple pool, which, as he continued to gaze, seemed to change its form kaleidoscopically to a large crystalline ball. But what was that moving about in this crystal? A form. It came nearer, clearer, and as it did so, he recognized Roberta struggling and waving her thin arms out of the water and reaching toward him. God, how terrible! The expression on her face. What in God's name was he thinking of anyway? Death. Murder. And suddenly becoming conscious that his courage, on which he had counted so much this long while to sustain him here, was leaving him, and he instantly and consciously plumbing the depths of his being in a vain search to recapture it. Git, ka! Git, ka! Git, ka! The weird, haunting cry of that unearthly bird again, so cold, so harsh. Here it was once more to startle him out of his soul flight into a realization of the real or unreal immediate problem, with all of its torturesome angles that lay before him. He must face this thing. He must. Git, ka! Git, ka! What was it sounding? A warning? A protest? A condemnation? The same bird that had marked the very birth of this miserable plan? For there it was now upon that dead tree, that wretched bird, and now it was flying to another one as dead, a little farther inland, and crying as it did so, God! And then to the shore again in spite of himself, for Clyde, in order to justify his having brought his bag, now must suggest that pictures of this be taken, and of Roberta and of himself, possibly, on land and water, for that would bring her into the boat again without his bag, which would be safe and dry on land, and once on shore, actually pretending to be seeking out very special views here and there, while he fixed in his mind the exact tree at the base of which he might leave his bag against his return, which must be soon now, must be soon. They would not come on shore again together. Never, never. And that in spite of Roberta protesting that she was getting tired. And did he not think they ought to be starting back pretty soon? It must be after 5, surely, and Clyde assuring her that presently they would, after he'd made 1 or 2 more pictures of her in the boat with those wonderful trees, that island and this dark water around and beneath her. His wet, damp, nervous hands, and his dark, liquid, nervous eyes, looking anywhere but at her. And then once more in the water again, about 500 feet from the shore, the while he fumbled aimlessly with a hard and heavy and yet small camera that he now held, as the boat floated out nearer the center, and then at this point in time looking fearfully about. For now, in spite of himself, the long-evaded and yet commanding moment, and no voice or figure or sound on shore, no road or cabin or smoke, and the moment which he or something had planned for him, and which was now to decide his fate at hand, the moment of action, of crisis. All that he needed to do now was to turn swiftly and savagely to one side or the other, leap up upon the left whale or right, and upset the boat, or failing that, rock it swiftly, and if Roberta protested too much, strike her with the camera in his hand, or one of the oars at his right. It could be done. It could be done, swiftly and simply, were he now of the mind and heart, or lack of it, with him swimming swiftly away thereafter to freedom, to success, of course, to Sandra and happiness, a new and greater and sweeter life than any he'd ever known. Yet why was he waiting now? What was the matter with him anyhow? Why was he waiting? At this cataclysmic moment, and in the face of the utmost, the most urgent need of action, a sudden palsy of the will, of courage, of hate or rage sufficient, and with Roberta from her seat in the stern of the boat, gazing at his troubled and then suddenly distorted and fulgurous, yet weak and even unbalanced face. End of cassette number 1, side 1. To continue, please turn the cassette over. Cassette number 1, side 2 of An American Tragedy, Part 2. Clyde's face of a sudden, instead of angry, ferocious, demoniac, confused and all but meaningless in its registration of a balanced combat between fear, a chemic revulsion against death or murderous brutality that would bring death, and a harried and restless and yet self-repressed desire to do, yet temporarily unbreakable here now, a static between a powerful compulsion to do and yet not to do. And in the meantime his eyes, the pupils of the same growing momentarily larger and more lurid, his face and body and hands tense and contracted, the stillness of his position, the balanced immobility of the mood more and more ominous, yet in truth not suggesting a brutal, courageous power to destroy, but the imminence of trance or spasm. And Roberta, suddenly noticing the strangeness of it all, the something of the eerie unreason or physical and mental indetermination, so strangely and painfully contrasting with this scene, exclaiming, "Why, Clyde, what is it? Whatever's the matter with you, anyhow? You look so strange, Why, I never saw you look like this before. What is it?" And suddenly rising, or rather leaning forward, and by crawling along the even keel, attempting to approach him, since he looked as though he was about to fall forward into the boat, or to one side and out into the water. And Clyde, as instantly sensing the profoundness of his own failure, his own cowardice or inadequateness for such an occasion, as instantly yielding to a tide of submerged hate, not only for himself but Roberta, her power or that of life to restrain him in this way, and yet fearing to act in any way, being unwilling to, being willing only to say that never, never would he marry her, that never, even should she expose him, would he leave here with her to marry her, that he was in love with Sandra, and would cling only to her, and yet not being able to say that even, but angry and confused and glowering. And then, as she drew near him, seeking to take his hand in hers and the camera from him in order to put it in the boat, he flinging out at her, but not even then with any intention to do other than free himself of her, her touch, her pleading, consoling sympathy, her presence forever. God! Yet the camera still unconsciously held tight, pushing at her with so much vehemence as not only to strike her lips and nose and chin with it, but to throw her back sidewise toward the left whale, which caused the boat to careen to the very water's edge. And then he, stirred by her sharp scream, as much due to the lurch of the boat as the cut on her nose and lip, rising and reaching half to assist or recapture, and half to apologize for the unintended blow, yet in so doing completely capsizing the boat, himself and Roberta being as instantly thrown into the water, and the left whale of the boat as it turned, striking Roberta on the head as she sank, and then rose for the first time, her frantic, contorted face turned to Clyde, who by now had righted himself, for she was stunned, horror-struck, unintelligible with pain and fear, her lifelong fear of water and drowning and the blow he had so accidentally and all but unconsciously administered. "Help! Help! Oh, my God! I'm drowning! I'm drowning! Help! Oh, my God! Clyde! Clyde!" And then the voice at his ear. "But is not this that which you have been thinking and wishing for this while, you in your great need? And behold, for despite your fear, your cowardice, this has been done for you. An accident, an unintentional blow on your part is now saving you the labor of what you sought, and yet did not have the courage to do. But will you now, and when you need not, since it is an accident, by going to her rescue, once more plunge yourself in the horror of that defeat and failure which had so tortured you and from which this now releases you? You might save her, but again you might not, for see how she strikes about. She's stunned. She herself is unable to save herself, and by her erratic terror, if you draw nearer now, may bring about your own death also. But you desire to live, and her living will make your life not worthwhile from now on. Rest but a moment, a fraction of a minute. Wait. Ignore the pity of that appeal, and then... But there, behold, it is over. She is sinking now. You will never, never see her alive any more, ever. And there's your own hat upon the water as you wished, and upon the boat, clinging to that rowlock, a veil belonging to her. Leave it. Will it not show that this was an accident? And apart from that, nothing. A few ripples. The peace and solemnity of this wondrous scene. And then once more the voice of that weird, contemptuous, mocking, lonely bird. Kit, 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 caw! Kit, 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 caw! Kit, 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 caw! The cry of that devilish bird upon that dead limb, the weir, weir. And then Clyde, with the sound of Roberta's cries still in his ears, that last frantic, quite appealing look in her eyes, swimming heavily, gloomily, and darkly to shore, and the thought that after all he'd not really killed her. No, no, thank God for that. He had not. And yet, stepping up on the nearby bank and shaking the water from his clothes, had he? Or had he not? Or had he not refused to go to her rescue, and when he might have saved her, and when the fault for casting her in the water, however accidentally, was so truly his? And yet, the dusk and silence of a closing day, a concealed spot in the depths of the same sheltering woods, where alone and dripping, his dry bag near, Clyde stood, and by waiting sought to dry himself, but in the interim removing from the side of the bag the unused tripod of his camera, and seeking an obscure dead log farther in the woods, hiding it. Had anyone seen? Was anyone looking? Then returning and wondering as to the direction. He must go west and then south. He must not get turned about. But the repeated cry of that bird, harsh, nerve-shaking, and then the gloom, in spite of the summer stars, and a youth making his way through a dark, uninhabited wood, a dry straw hat upon his head, a bag in his hand, walking briskly and yet warily, south, south. Book 3. Chapter 1. Cataraqui County, extending from the northernmost line of the village, known as 3 Mile Bay, on the south to the Canadian border, on the north, a distance of 50 miles, and from Senatchit and Indian Lakes, on the east to the Rock and Scarf Rivers on the west, a width of 30 miles, its greater portion covered by uninhabited forests and lakes, yet dotted here and there with such villages and hamlets as Kuntz, Grass Lake, North Wallace, Brown Lake, with Bridgeburg, the county seat, numbering no less than 2,000 souls of the 15,000 in the entire county, and the central square of the town occupied by the old and yet not ungraceful county courthouse, a cupola with a clock and some pigeons surmounting it, the 4 principal business streets of the small town facing it. In the office of the county coroner in the northeast corner of the building on Friday, July 9th, one Fred Height, coroner, a large and broad-shouldered individual with a set of gray-brown whiskers such as might have graced a Mormon elder. His face was large, and his hands and his feet also, and his girth was proportionate. At the time that this presentation begins, about 2:30 in the afternoon, he was lethargically turning the leaves of a mail-order catalogue for which his wife had asked him to write, and while deciphering from its pages the price of shoes, jackets, hats, and caps for his 5 omnivorous children, a greatcoat for himself of soothing proportions, high collar, broad belt, large impressive buttons chancing to take his eye, he'd paused to consider regretfully that the family budget of $3,000 a year would never permit of so great luxury this coming winter, particularly since his wife Ella had had her mind upon a fur coat for at least 3 winters past. However, his thoughts might have eventuated on this occasion. They were interrupted by the whir of a telephone bell. "Yes, this is Mr. Height speaking. Wallace Upham of Big Bittern. Why, yes, go on, Wallace. Young couple drowned. All right, just wait a moment." He turned to the politically active youth who drew a salary from the county under the listing of secretary to the coroner. "Get these points, Earl." Then into the telephone. "All right, Wallace. Now give me all the facts. Everything. Yes. The body of the wife found, but not that of the husband. Yes. A boat upset on the South Shore. Yes. Straw hat without any lining. Yes. Some marks about her mouth and eye. Her coat and hat at the inn. Yes. A letter in one of the pockets of the coat addressed to who? Mrs. Titus Alden, Biltz, Mimico County. Yes. Still dragging for the man's body, are they? Yes, no trace of him yet. I see. All right, Wallace. Well, I'll tell you, Wallace. Have them leave the coat and hat just where they are. Let me see, it's 2:30 now. I'll be up on the 4 o'clock. The bus from the inn there meets that, doesn't it? Well, I'll be over on that, sure. And, Wallace, I wish you'd write down the names of all present who saw the body brought up. What was that? 18 feet of water at least? Yes. A veil caught in one of the rowlocks? Yes. A brown veil? Yes, sure. That's all. Well, then have them leave everything just as they found, Wallace, and I'll be right up. Yes, Wallace, thank you. Goodbye. Slowly Mr. Height restored the receiver to the hook, and as slowly arose from the capacious walnut-hued chair in which he sat, stroking his heavy whiskers, while he eyed Earl Newcomb, combination typist, record clerk, and what not. You got all that down, did you, Earl? Yes, sir. Well, you better get your hat and coat and come along with me. We'll have to catch that 3:10. You can fill in a few subpoenas on the train. I should say you better take 15 or 20 to be on the safe side, and take the names of such witnesses as we can find on the spot. And you better call up Mrs. Hyde and say 'tain't likely I'll be home for dinner tonight, or much before the down train. We may have to stay up there until tomorrow. You never can tell in these cases how they're going to turn out, and it's best to be on the safe side.' Hyde turned to a coat-room in one corner of the musty old room, and extracted a large soft-brimmed straw hat, the downward-curving edges of which seemed to heighten the really bland and yet ogreish effect of his protruding eyes and voluminous whiskers, and having thus equipped himself, said, 'I'm just going in the sheriff's office a minute, Earl. You'd better call up the Republican and the Democrat and tell 'em about this, so they won't think we're slighting 'em. Then I'll meet you down at the station.' And he lumbered out, and Earl Newcomb, a tall, slender, shock-headed young man of perhaps 19, and of a very serious, if at times befuddled manner, at once seized a sheaf of subpoenas, and while stuffing these in his pocket, sought to get Mrs. Hyde on the telephone. And then, after explaining to the newspapers about a reported double drowning at Big Bittern, he seized his own blue-banded straw hat, some 2 sizes too large for him, and hurried down the hall, only to encounter, opposite the wide-open office door of the district attorney, Zella Saunders, spinster and solitary stenographer, to the locally somewhat famous and mercurial Orville W. Mason, district attorney. She was on her way to the auditor's office, but being struck by the preoccupation and haste of Mr. Newcomb, usually so much more deliberate, she now called, "Hello, Earl, what's the rush? Where are you going so fast?" "Double drowning up at Big Britain, we hear. Maybe something worse. Mr. Height's going up and I'm going along. We have to make that 3:10. "Who said so? Is it anyone from here?" "Don't know yet, but don't think so. There was a letter in the girl's pocket, addressed to someone in Bill's, Mimico County, a Mrs. Olden. I'll tell you when we get back, or I'll telephone you." "My goodness, if it's a crime, Mr. Mason will be interested, won't he?" "Sure, I'll telephone him, or Mr. Height will. If you see Bud Parker or Carol Badnell, tell 'em I had to go out of town. And call up my mother for me, will you, Zilla, and tell her too? I'm afraid I won't have time." "Sure I will, Earl." "Thanks." And highly interested by this latest development in the ordinary humdrum life of his chief, he skipped gaily and even eagerly down the south steps of the Cataraqui County Courthouse, while Miss Saunders, knowing that her own chief was off on some business connected with the approaching county Republican convention, and there being no one else in his office with whom she could communicate at this time, went on to the auditor's office, where it was possible to retail to any who might be assembled there all that she had gathered concerning this seemingly important lake tragedy. Chapter 2. The information obtained by Coroner Height and his assistant was of a singular and disturbing character. In the first instance, because of the disappearance of a boat and an apparently happy and attractive couple bent on sightseeing, an early morning search, instigated by the innkeeper of this region, had revealed, in Moon Cove, the presence of the overturned canoe, also the hat and veil, and immediately such available employees, as well as guides and guests of the inn, as could be impressed, had begun diving into the waters, or by means of long poles, equipped with hooks, attempting to bring one or both bodies to the surface. The fact, as reported by Sim Shute, the guide, as well as the innkeeper and the boathouse lessee, that the lost girl was both young and attractive, and her companion seemingly a youth of some means, was sufficient to whet the interest of this late group of woodsmen and inn employees to a point which verged on sorrow. And in addition, there was intense curiosity as to how, on so fair and windless a day, so strange an accident could have occurred. But what created far more excitement after a very little time was the fact that at high noon one of the men who trolled, John Pole, a woodsman, was at last successful in bringing to the surface Roberta herself, drawn upward by the skirt of her dress, obviously bruised about the face, the lips and nose, and above and below the right eye, a fact which to those who were assisting at once seemed to be suspicious. Indeed, John Pole, who with Joe Rayner at the oars was the one who had succeeded in bringing her to the surface, had exclaimed at once on seeing her, "Why, the poor little thing! She don't seem to weigh more'n nothing at all. It's a wonder to me she could have sunk." And then, reaching over and gathering her in his strong arms, he drew her in, dripping and lifeless, while his companions signaled to the other searchers, who came swiftly, and putting back from her face the long brown thick hair, which the action of the water had swirled concealingly across it, he added, "I do declare, Joe, look a-here. It does look like the child might have been hit by something. Look a-here, Joe." And soon the group of woodsmen and inn guests in their boats alongside were looking at the brownish-blue marks on Roberta's face. And forthwith, even while the body of Roberta was being taken north to the boathouse, and the dragging for the body of the lost man was resumed, suspicions were being voiced in such phrases as, "Well, it looks kind of queer, them marks and all, don't it? It's curious a boat like that could have upset on a day like yesterday. We'll soon know if he's down there or not." The feeling following failure after hours of fruitless search for him, definitely coalescing at last into the conclusion that more than likely he was not down there at all. A hard and stirring thought to all. Subsequent to this, the guide who had brought Clyde and Roberta from Gun Lodge, conferring with the innkeepers at Big Bittern and Grass Lake, it was factually determined, 1, that the drowned girl had left her bag at Gun Lodge, whereas Clifford Golden had taken his with him. 2, that there was a disturbing discrepancy between the registration at Grass Lake and that at Big Bittern, the names Carl Graham and Clifford Golden being carefully discussed by the two innkeepers, and the identity of the bearer as to looks established. And 3, that the said Clifford Golden or Carl Graham had asked of the guide who had driven him over to Big Bittern whether there were many people on the lake that day, and thereafter the suspicions thus far engendered further coalescing into the certainty that there had been foul play. There was scarcely any doubt of it. Immediately upon his arrival, Coroner Height was made to understand that these men of the North Woods were deeply moved, and in addition determined in their suspicions. They did not believe that the body of Clifford Golden or Carl Graham had ever sunk to the bottom of the lake, with the result that Height, on viewing the body of the unknown girl laid carefully on a cot in the boathouse, and finding her young and attractive, was strangely affected, not only by her looks, but by this circumambient atmosphere of suspicion. Worse yet, on retiring to the office of the manager of the inn, and being handed the letter found in the pocket of Roberta's coat, he was definitely swayed in the direction of a somber and unshakable suspicion. For he read, "Grass Lake, New York, July 8th. Dearest Mamma, we're up here and we're going to be married, but this is for your eyes alone. Please don't show it to Papa or anyone, for it mustn't become known yet. I told you why at Christmas, and you're not to worry or ask any questions or tell anyone except just that you've heard from me and know where I am. Not anybody. And you mustn't think I won't be getting along all right, because I will be. Here's a big hug and kiss for each cheek, Mamma. Be sure and make Father understand that it's all right without telling him anything, or Emily or Tom or Gifford either. Do you hear? I'm sending you nice big kisses. Lovingly, Bert. P.S. This must be your secret and mine until I write you different a little later on." And in the upper right-hand corner of the paper, as well as on the envelope, were printed the words, "Grass Lake Inn, Grass Lake, New York, Jack Evans, Prop." And the letter had evidently been written this morning after the night they'd spent at Grass Lake as Mr. and Mrs. Carl Graham. The waywardness of young girls. For plainly, as this letter indicated, these two had stayed together as man and wife at that inn when they were not as yet married. He winced as he read, for he had daughters of his own, of whom he was exceedingly fond. But at this point he had a thought. A quadrennial county election was impending, the voting to take place the following November, at which were to be chosen for 3 years more the entire roster of county offices, his own included, and in addition this year, a county judge whose term was for 6 years. In August, some 6 weeks further on, were to be held the county Republican and Democratic conventions, at which were to be chosen the regular party nominees for their respective offices. Yet for no one of these places thus far, other than that of the county judgeship, could the present incumbent of the office of district attorney possibly look forward with any hope, since already he'd held the position of district attorney for 2 consecutive terms, a length of office due to the fact that not only was he a good orator of the inland political stripe, but also, as the chief legal official of the county, he was in a position to do one and another of his friends a favor. But now, unless he were so fortunate as to be nominated and subsequently elected to this county judgeship, defeat and political doldrums loomed ahead. For during all his term of office thus far, there had been no really important case in connection with which he'd been able to distinguish himself and so rightfully and hopefully demand further recognition from the people. But now, as the coroner shrewdly foresaw, might not this case prove the very thing to fix the attention and favor of the people upon one man, the incumbent district attorney, a close and helpful friend of his thus far, and so sufficiently redound to his credit and strength, and through him to the party ticket itself, so that at the coming election all might be elected, the reigning district attorney thus winning for himself not only the nomination for, but his election to the 6-year term judgeship. Stranger things than this had happened in the political world. Immediately he decided not to answer any questions in regard to this letter, since it promised a quick solution of the mystery of the perpetrator of the crime, if there had been one, plus exceptional credit in the present political situation to whosoever should appear to be instrumental in the same. At the same time, he had once ordered Earl Newcomb, as well as the guide who had brought Roberta and Clyde to Big Bittern, to return to Gun Lodge Station from where the couple had come, and say that under no circumstances was the bag held there to be surrendered to anyone save himself or a representative of the district attorney. Then, when he was about to telephone to Bouts to ascertain whether there was such a family as Alden, possessing a daughter by the name of Bert, or possibly Alberta, he was most providentially, as it seemed to him, interrupted by 2 men and a boy, trappers and hunters of this region, who, accompanied by a crowd of those now familiar with the tragedy, were almost tumultuously ushered into his presence. For they had news of the utmost importance. As they now related, with many interruptions and corrections, at about 5 o'clock of the afternoon of the day on which Roberta was drowned, they were setting out from 3 Mile Bay, some 12 miles south of Big Bittern, to hunt and fish in and near this lake. And as they now unanimously testified on the night in question, at about 9 o'clock, as they were nearing the south shore of Big Bittern, perhaps 3 miles to the south of it, they'd encountered a young man, whom they took to be some stranger making his way from the inn at Big Bittern south to the village at 3 Mile Bay. He was a smartishly and decidedly well-dressed youth for these parts, as they now said, wearing a straw hat and carrying a bag, and at the time they wondered why such a trip on foot and at such an hour, since there was a train south early next morning which reached 3 Mile Bay in an hour's time. And why, too, should he have been so startled at meeting them? For as they described it, on his encountering them in the woods thus, he jumped back as though startled, and worse, terrified, as though about to run. To be sure, the lantern one of them was carrying was turned exceedingly low, the moon being still bright, and they had walked quietly, as became men who were listening for wildlife of any kind. At the same time, surely this was a perfectly safe part of the country, traversed for the most part by honest citizens such as themselves, and there was no need for a young man to jump, as though he was seeking to hide in the brush. However, when the youth, Bud Brunick, who carried the light, turned it up, the stranger seemed to recover his poise, and after a moment, in response to their "Howdy," had replied, "How do you do? How far is it to 3 Mile Bay?" And they had replied, "About 7 mile." And then he had gone on, and they also discussing the encounter. And now, since the description of this youth tallied almost exactly with that given by the guide who'd driven Clyde over from Gun Lodge, as well as that furnished by the innkeepers at Big Bittern and Grass Lake, it seemed all too plain that he must be the same youth who'd been in that boat with the mysterious dead girl. At once Earl Newcomb suggested to his chief that he be permitted to telephone to the one innkeeper at 3 Mile Bay, to see if by any chance this mysterious stranger had been seen or had registered there. He had not, nor apparently at that time had he been seen by any other than the three men. In fact, he'd vanished as though into air, although by nightfall of the same day it was established that on the morning following the chance meeting of the men with the stranger, a youth of somewhat the same description and carrying a bag, but wearing a cap, not a straw hat, had taken passage for Sharon on the small lake steamer Cygnus, plying between that place and 3 Mile Bay. But again, beyond that point, the trail appeared to be lost. No one at Sharon, at least up to this time, seemed to recall either the arrival or departure of any such person. Even the captain himself, as he later testified, had not particularly noticed his debarkation. There were some 14 others going down the lake that day, and he could not be sure of any one person. But in so far as the group at Big Bittern was concerned, the conclusion slowly but definitely impressed itself upon all those present that whoever this individual was, he was an unmitigated villain, a reptilian villain, and forthwith there was doubled and trebled in the minds of all a most urgent desire that he be overtaken and captured. The scoundrel! The murderer! And at once there was broadcast throughout this region by word of mouth, telephone, telegraph, to such papers as the Argus and Times-Union of Albany and the Star of Lycurgus, the news of this pathetic tragedy, with the added hint that it might conceal a crime of the gravest character. Chapter 3. Coroner Height, his official duties completed for the time being, found himself pondering, as he traveled south on the lake train, how he was to proceed farther. What was the next step he should take in this pathetic affair? For the coroner, as he looked at Roberta before he left, was really deeply moved. She seemed so young and innocent-looking and pretty, the little blue serge dress lying heavily and clinging tightly to her, her very small hands folded across her breast, her warm brown hair still damp from its 24 hours in the water, yet somehow suggesting some of the vivacity and passion that had invested her in life. All seemed to indicate a sweetness which had nothing to do with crime. But deplorable as it might be, and undoubtedly was, there was another aspect of the case that more vitally concerned himself. Should he go to Bilt's and convey to the Mrs. Alden of the letter the dreadful intelligence of her daughter's death, at the same time inquiring about the character and whereabouts of the man who'd been with her? Or should he proceed first to District Attorney Mason's office in Bridgeburg, and having imparted to him all the details of the case, allow that gentleman to assume the painful responsibility of devastating a probably utterly respectable home? For there was the political situation to be considered, and while he himself might act, and so take personal credit, still there was this general party situation to be thought of. A strong man should undoubtedly head and so strengthen the party ticket this fall, and here was the golden opportunity. The latter course seemed wiser. It would provide his friend, the district attorney, with his great chance. Arriving in Bridgeburg in this mood, he ponderously invaded the office of Orville W. Mason, the district attorney, who immediately sat up, all attention, sensing something of import in the coroner's manner. Mason was a short, broad-chested, broad-backed, and vigorous individual physically, but in his late youth had been so unfortunate as to have an otherwise pleasant and even arresting face marred by a broken nose, which gave to him a most unprepossessing, almost sinister look. Yet he was far from sinister, rather romantic and emotional. His boyhood had been one of poverty and neglect, causing him in his later and somewhat more successful years to look on those with whom life had dealt more kindly as too favorably treated. The son of a poor farmer's widow, he'd seen his mother put to such straits to make ends meet that by the time he reached the age of 12, he'd surrendered nearly all the pleasures of youth in order to assist her. And then at 14, while skating, he'd fallen and broken his nose in such a way as to forever disfigure his face. Thereafter, feeling himself handicapped in the youthful sorting contests which gave to other boys the female companions he most craved, he'd grown exceedingly sensitive to the fact of his facial handicap, and this had eventually resulted in what the Freudians are accustomed to describe as a psychic sex scar. At the age of 17, however, he had succeeded in interesting the publisher and editor of the Bridgeburg Republican to the extent that he was eventually installed as official local news-gatherer of the town. Later he came to be the Cataraqui County correspondent of such papers as the Albany Times-Union and the Utica Star, ending eventually at the age of 19 with the privilege of studying law in the office of one ex-judge, Davis Rickofer of Bridgeburg. And a few years later, after having been admitted to the bar, he'd been taken up by several county politicians and merchants who saw to it that he was sent to the lower house of the state legislature for some 6 consecutive years, where by reason of a modest and at the same time shrewd and ambitious willingness to do as he was instructed, he attained favor with those at the Capitol, while at the same time retaining the goodwill of his hometown sponsors. Later, returning to Bridgeburg, and possessing some gifts of oratory, he was given first the position of assistant district attorney for 4 years, and following that elected auditor, and subsequently district attorney for 2 terms of 4 years each. Having acquired so high a position locally, he was able to marry the daughter of a local druggist of some means, and 2 children had been born to them. In regard to this particular case, he'd already heard from Miss Saunders all she knew of the drowning, and, like the coroner, had been immediately impressed with the fact that the probable publicity attendant on such a case as this appeared to be might be just what he needed to revive a wavering political prestige, and might perhaps solve the problem of his future. At any rate, he was most intensely interested, so that now, upon sight of Height, he showed plainly the keen interest he felt in the case. "Well, Colonel Height." "Well, Orville, I'm just back from Big Bittern. It looks to me as though I've got a case for you now that's going to take quite a little of your time." Height's large eyes bulged, and conveyed hints of much more than was implied by his non-committal opening remark. "You mean that drowning up there?" returned the district attorney. "Yes, sir, just that," replied the coroner. "You've some reason for thinking there's something wrong up there?" "Well, the truth is, Orville, I think there's hardly a doubt that this is a case of murder." Height's heavy eyes glowed somberly. "Of course, it's best to be on the safe side, and I'm only telling you this in confidence, because even yet I'm not absolutely positive that that young man's body may not be in the lake. But it looks mighty suspicious to me, Orville. There's been at least 15 men up there in rowboats all day yesterday and today, dragging the south part of that lake. I had a number of the boys take soundings here and there, and the water ain't more than 25 feet deep at any point, but so far they haven't found any trace of him. They brought her up about 1 o'clock yesterday, after they'd been only dragging a few hours, and a mighty pretty girl she is, too, Orville, quite young, not more than 18 or 20, I should say. But there are some very suspicious circumstances about it all that make me think that he ain't in there. In fact, I never saw a case that I thought looked more like a devilish crime than this." As he said this, he began to search in the right-hand pocket of his well-worn and baggy linen suit, and finally extracted Roberta's letter, which he handed his friend, drawing up a chair and seating himself, while the district attorney proceeded to read. "Well, this does look rather suspicious, don't it?" he announced as he finished. "You say they haven't found him yet. Well, have you communicated with this woman to see what she knows about it?" "No, Orville, I haven't," replied Height slowly and meditatively, "and I'll tell you why. The fact is, I decided up there last night that this was something I'd better talk over with you before I did anything at all. You know what the political situation here is just now, and how the proper handling of a case like this is likely to affect public opinion this fall. And while I certainly don't think we ought to mix politics in with crime, there certainly is no reason why we shouldn't handle this in such a way as to make it count in our favor. So I thought I'd better come and see you first. Of course, if you want me to, Orville, I'll go over there. Only I was thinking that perhaps it would be better for you to go and find out just who this fellow is and all about him. You know what a case like this might mean from a political point of view, if only we clean it up, and I know you're the one to do it, Orville." "Thanks, Fred, thanks," replied Mason, solemnly tapping his desk with the letter and squinting at his friend. "I'm grateful to you for your opinion, and you've outlined the very best way to go about it, I think. You're sure no one outside yourself has seen this letter?" "Only the envelope, and no one but Mr. Hubbard, the proprietor of the inn up there, has seen that, and he told me that he found it in her pocket and took charge of it for fear it might disappear or be opened before I got there. He said he had a feeling there might be something wrong the moment he heard of the drowning, The young man had acted so nervous, strange like, he said. "Very good, Fred. Then don't say anything more about it to anyone for the present, will you? I'll go right over there, of course. But what else did you find? Anything?" Mr. Mason was quite alive now, interrogative, dynamic, and a bit dictatorial in his manner even to his old friend. "Plenty, plenty," replied the coroner, most sagely and solemnly. "There were some suspicious cuts or marks under the girl's right eye and above the left temple, Orville, and across the lip and nose, as though the poor little thing might have been hit by something, a stone or a stick, or one of those oars that they found floating up there. She's just a child yet, Orville, in looks and size, anyhow. A very pretty girl, but not as good as she might have been, as I'll show you presently." At this point the coroner paused to extract a large handkerchief and blow into it a very loud blast, brushing his beard afterward in a most orderly way. "I didn't have time to get a doctor up there, and besides I'm going to hold the inquest down here Monday if I can. I've ordered the Lutz boys to go up there today and bring her body down. But the most suspicious of all the evidence that has come to light so far, Orville, is the testimony of 2 men and a boy who live up at 3 Mile Bay, and who were walking up to Big Bittern on Thursday night to hunt and fish. I had Earl take down their names and subpoena 'em for the inquest next Monday." And the coroner proceeded to detail their testimony about their accidental meeting of Clyde. "Well, well," interjected the district attorney, thoroughly interested. "Then another thing, Orville," continued the coroner. "I had Earl telephone the 3 Mile Bay people, the owner of the hotel there, as well as the postmaster and the town marshal. But the only person who appears to have seen the young man is the captain of that little steamboat that runs from 3 Mile Bay to Sharon. You know the man, I guess, Captain Mooney. I left word with Earl to subpoena him, too. According to him, about 8:30 Friday morning, or just before his boat started for Sharon on its first trip, this same young man, or someone very much like the description furnished, carrying a suitcase and wearing a cap — he had on a straw hat when those 3 men met him — came on board and paid his way to Sharon and got off there. Good-looking young chap, the captain says, very spry and well-dressed, more like a young society man than anything else, and very standoffish." "Yes, yes," commented Mason. "I also had Earl telephone the people at Sharon, whoever he could reach, to see if he'd been seen there getting off, but up to the time I left last night no one seemed to remember him. But I left word for Earl to telegraph a description of him to all the resort hotels and stations hereabouts, so that if he's anywhere around they'll be on the lookout for him. I thought you'd want me to do that, but I think you'd better give me a writ for that bag at Gun Lodge Station. That may contain something we ought to know. I'll go up and get it myself. Then I want to go to Grass Lake and 3 Mile Bay and Sharon yet today, if I can, and see what else I can find. But I'm afraid, Orville, it's a plain case of murder. The way he took that young girl to that hotel up there at Grass Lake, and then registered under another name at Big Bittern, and the way he had her leave her bag and took his own with him." He shook his head most solemnly. "Those are not the actions of an honest young man, Orville, and you know it. What I can't understand is how her parents could let her go off like that anywhere with a man without knowing about him in the first place." "That's true," replied Mason tactfully, but made intensely curious by the fact that it had at least been partially established that the girl in the case was not as good as she should have been. Adultery, and with some youth of means, no doubt, from some one of the big cities to the south. The prominence and publicity with which his own activities in connection with this were very likely to be laden. At once he got up, energetically stirred. If he could only catch such a reptilian criminal, and that in the face of all the sentiment that such a brutal murder was likely to inspire. The August Convention and nominations, the fall election. "Well, I'll be switched," he exclaimed, the presence of Height, a religious and conservative man, suppressing anything more emphatic. "I do believe we're on the trail of something important, Fred. I really think so. It looks very black to me, a most damnable outrage. I suppose the first thing to do, really, is to telephone over there and see if there's such a family as Alden and exactly where they live. It's not more than 50 miles direct by car, if that much. Poor roads, then," he added. "Then, that poor woman. I dread that scene. It will be a painful one, I know." Then he called Zilla, and asked her to ascertain if there was such a person as Titus Alden living near Bouts, also exactly how to get there. Next, he added, the first thing to do will be to get Burton back here. Burton, being Burton Burley, his legal assistant, who'd gone away for a weekend vacation, and put him in charge so as to furnish you whatever you need in the ways of writs and so on, Fred, while I go right over to see this poor woman. And then if you'll have Earl go back up there and get that suitcase, I'll be most obliged to you. I'll bring the father back with me, too, to identify the body. But don't say anything at all about this letter now, or my going over there until I see you later, see?" He grasped the hand of his friend. "In the meantime," he went on, a little grandiosely, now feeling the tang of great affairs upon him, "I want to thank you, Fred. I certainly do, and I won't forget it either. You know that, don't you?" He looked his old friend squarely in the eye. "This may turn out better than we think. It looks to be the biggest and most important case in all my term of office, and if we can only clean it up satisfactorily and quickly before things break here this fall, it may do us all some good, eh?" "Quite so, Orville, quite so," commented Fred Height. "Not, as I said before, that I think we ought to mix politics in with a thing like this, but since it's come about so—" He paused meditatively. "And in the meantime," continued the district attorney, "if you'll have Earl have some pictures made of the exact position where the boat, oars, and hat were found, as well as mark the spot where the body was found, and subpoena as many witnesses as you can, I'll have vouchers for it all put through with the auditor, and tomorrow or Monday I'll pitch in and help myself." And here he gripped Height's right hand, then patted him on the shoulder, and Height, much gratified by his various moves so far, and in consequence hopeful for the future, now took up his weird straw hat, and buttoning his thin loose coat, returned to his office to get his faithful Earl on the long-distance telephone to instruct him and to say that he was returning to the scene of the crime himself. Chapter 4. Orville Mason could readily sympathize with a family which on sight struck him as having perhaps, like himself, endured the whips, the scorns, and contumelies of life. As he drove up in his official car from Bridgeburg at about 4 o'clock that Saturday afternoon, there was the old tatterdemalion farmhouse, and Titus Alden himself in his shirt-sleeves and overalls, coming up from a pig-pen at the foot of the hill, his face and body suggesting a man who is constantly conscious of the fact that he's made out so poorly. And now Mason regretted that he had not telephoned before leaving Bridgeburg, for he could see that the news of his daughter's death would shock such a man as this most terribly. At the same time, Titus, noting his approach and assuming that it might be someone who was seeking a direction, civilly approached him. "Is this Mr. Titus Alden?" "Yes, sir, that's my name." "Mr. Alden, my name is Mason. I'm from Bridgeburg, district attorney of Cataraqui County." "Yes, sir," replied Titus, wondering by what strange chance the district attorney of so distant a county should be approaching and inquiring of him. And Mason now looked at Titus, not knowing just how to begin. The bitterness of the news he had to impart, the crumpling power of it upon such an obviously feeble and inadequate soul. They had paused under one of the large dark fir trees that stood in front of the house. The wind in its needles was whispering its world-old murmur. "Mr. Alden," began Mason, with more solemnity and delicacy than ordinarily characterized him, "you are the father of a girl by the name of Bert, or possibly Alberta, are you not? I'm not sure that I have the name right." "Roberta," corrected Titus Alden, a titillating sense of something untoward affecting his nerves as he said it. And Mason, before making it impossible, probably, for this man to connectedly inform him concerning all that he wished to know, now proceeded to inquire, "By the way, do you happen to know a young man around here by the name of Clifford Golden?" "I don't recall that I ever heard of any such person," replied Titus slowly. "Or Carl Graham? No, sir. No one by that name either that I recall now." "I thought so," exclaimed Mason, more to himself than to Titus. "By the way," this shrewdly and commandingly, "where is your daughter now?" "Why, she's in Lycurgus at present. She works there. But why do you ask? Has she done anything she shouldn't? Been to see you about anything?" He achieved a wry smile while his grey-blue eyes were by now perturbed by puzzled inquiry. "One moment, Mr. Alden," proceeded Mason, tenderly and yet most firmly and effectively. "I will explain everything to you in a moment. Just now I want to ask a few necessary questions." And he gazed at Titus earnestly and sympathetically. "How long has it been since you last saw your daughter?" "Why, she left here last Tuesday morning to go back to Lycurgus. She works down there for the Griffiths Collar and Shirt Company, but—" "Now, one moment," insisted the district attorney determinedly. "I'll explain all in a moment. She was up here over the weekend, possibly. Is that it?" "She was up here on a vacation for about a month," explained Titus, slowly and meticulously. "She wasn't feeling so very good, and she came home to rest up a bit. She was all right when she left. You don't mean to tell me, Mr. Mason, that anything's gone wrong with her, do you?" He lifted one long brown hand to his chin and cheek in a gesture of nervous inquiry. "If I thought there was anything like that—" He ran his hand through his thinning gray hair. "Have you had any word from her since she left here?" Mason went on quietly, determined to extract as much practical information as possible before the great blow fell. "Any information that she was going anywhere but back there?" "No, sir, we haven't. She's not hurt in any way, is she? She's not done anything that's got her into trouble. But no, that couldn't be. But your questions, the way you talk—" He was now trembling slightly, the hand that sought his thin pale lips visibly and aimlessly playing about his mouth. But instead of answering, the district attorney drew from his pocket the letter of Roberta to her mother, and displaying only the handwriting on the envelope, asked, "Is that the handwriting of your daughter?" "Yes, sir, that's her handwriting," replied Titus, his voice rising slightly. "But what is this, Mr. District Attorney? How do you come to have that? What's in there?" He clenched his hands in a nervous way, for in Mason's eyes he now clearly foresaw tragedy in some form. "What is this? What has she written in that letter? You must tell me. If anything has happened to my girl—" He began to look excitedly about, as though it were his intention to return to the house for aid, to communicate to his wife the dread that was coming upon him, while Mason, seeing the agony into which he had plunged him, at once seized him firmly and yet kindly by the arms and began, "Mr. Alden, this is one of those dark times in the lives of some of us, when all the courage we have is most needed. I hesitate to tell you, because I'm a man who's seen something of life, and I know you will suffer." "She's hurt! She's dead, maybe!" exclaimed Titus, almost shrilly, the pupils of his eyes dilating. Orville Mason nodded. "Roberta, my firstborn, my God, our Heavenly Father!" His body crumpled as though from a blow, and he leaned to steady himself against an adjacent tree. "But how? Where? In the factory by a machine? Oh, dear God!" He turned, as though to go to his wife, while the strong, scar-nosed district attorney sought to detain him. This book is continued on cassette number 2, side 1. Please fast forward to the end of this tape. An American Tragedy, Part 2, continuing on cassette number 2, side 1. Orville Mason said, "One moment, Mr. Alden, one moment. You must not go to your wife yet. I know this is very hard, terrible, but let me explain. Not in Lycurgus, not by any machine. No, drowned. In Big Bittern. She was up there on an outing on Thursday, do you understand? Do you hear? Thursday. She was drowned in Big Bittern on Thursday in a boat. It overturned." The excited gestures and words of Titus at this point so disturbed the district attorney that he found himself unable to explain as calmly as he would have liked the process by which even an assumed accidental drowning had come about. From the moment the word death in connection with Roberta had been used by Mason, the mental state of Alden was that of one not a little demented. After his first demands, he now began to vent a series of animal-like groans, as though the breath had been knocked from his body. At the same time he bent over, crumpled up as from pain, then struck his hands together and threw them to his temples. "My Roberta dead! My daughter! Oh, no, no, Roberta! Oh, my God! Not drowned! It can't be! And her mother speaking of her only an hour ago! This will be the death of her when she hears it. It will kill me, too. Yes, it will. Oh, my poor, dear, dear girl! My darling! I'm not strong enough to stand anything like this, Mr. District Attorney." He leaned heavily and wearily upon Mason's arms, while the latter sustained him as best he could. Then, after a moment, he turned questioningly and erratically toward the front door of the house, at which he gazed as one might who was wholly demented. "Who's to tell her?" he demanded. "How is anyone to tell her?" "But, Mr. Alden," consoled Mason, "for your own sake, for your wife's sake, I must ask you now to calm yourself and help me consider this matter as seriously as you would if it were not your daughter. There's much more to this than I've been able to tell you, but you must be calm. You must allow me to explain. This is all very terrible, and I sympathize with you wholly. I know what it means, but there are some dreadful and painful facts that you will have to know about. Listen, listen." And then, still holding Titus by the arm, he proceeded to explain as swiftly and forcefully as possible the various additional facts and suspicions in connection with the death of Roberta, finally giving him her letter to read, and winding up with, A crime, Mr. Alden. That's what we think over in Bridgeburg, or at least that's what we're afraid of. Plain murder, Mr. Alden, to use a hard, cold word in connection with it." He paused while Alden, struck by this, the element of crime, gazed as one not quite able to comprehend. And as he gazed, Mason went on, "And as much as I respect your feelings, still as the chief representative of the law in my county, I felt it to be my personal duty to come here today in order to find out whether there's anything that you or your wife or any of your family know about this Clifford Golden, or Carl Graham, or whoever he is, who lured your daughter to that lonely lake up there. And while I know that the blackest of suffering is yours right now, Mr. Alden, I maintain that it should be your wish as well as your duty to do whatever you can to help us clear up this matter. This letter here seems to indicate that your wife at least knows something concerning this individual. His name, anyhow." And he tapped the letter significantly and urgently. The moment the suggested element of violence and wrong against his daughter had been injected into this bitter loss, there was sufficient animal instinct, as well as curiosity, resentment, and love of the chase, inherent in Titus, to cause him to recover his balance sufficiently to give silent and solemn ear to what the district attorney was saying. His daughter not only drowned, but murdered, and that by some youth who, according to this letter, she was intending to marry, and he, her father, not even aware of his existence. Strange that his wife should know and he not, and that Roberta should not want him to know. And at once, born for the most part of religion, convention, and a general rural suspicion of all urban life, and the mystery and involuteness of its ungodly ways, there sprang into his mind the thought of a city seducer and betrayer, some youth of means, probably, whom Roberta had met since going to Lycurgus, and who had been able to seduce her by a promise of marriage which he was not willing to fulfill. And forthwith there flared up in his mind a terrible and quite uncontrollable desire for revenge upon anyone who could plot so horrible a crime as this against his daughter. The scoundrel, the raper, the murderer. Here he and his wife had been thinking that Roberta was quietly and earnestly and happily pursuing her hard, honest way in Lycurgus in order to help them and herself. And from Thursday afternoon until Friday, her body had lain beneath the waters of that lake, and they asleep in their comfortable beds or walking about, totally unaware of her dread state. And now her body in a strange room or morgue somewhere, unseen and unattended by any of all those who loved her so, and tomorrow to be removed by cold, indifferent public officials to Bridgeburg. "If there is a God," he exclaimed excitedly, "he will not let such a scoundrel as this go unpunished. Oh, no, he will not. I have yet to see," he suddenly quoted, "the children of the righteous forsaken, or their seed begging for bread." At the same time, a quivering compulsion for action dominating him, he added, "I must talk to my wife about this right away. Oh, yes, I must. No, you wait here. I must tell her first and alone. I'll be back. You just wait here. I know it will kill her. But she must know about this. Maybe she can tell us who this is, and then we can catch him before he manages to get too far away. But, oh, my poor girl, my poor dear Roberta, my good, kind, faithful daughter." And so, talking in a maundering manner, his eyes and face betraying an only half-sane misery, he turned, the shambling, automaton-like motions of his angular figure now directing him to a lean-to, whereas he knew Mrs. Alden was preparing some extra dishes for the next day, which was Sunday. But once there he paused in the doorway, without the courage to approach further, a man expressing in himself all the pathos of helpless humanity in the face of the relentless and inexplicable and indifferent forces of life. Mrs. Alden turned, and at the sight of his strained expression, dropped her own hands lifelessly, the message of his eyes as instantly putting to flight the simple, weary, and yet peaceful contemplation in her own. "Titus, for goodness sake, whatever is the matter?" Lifted hands, half-open mouth, an eerie, eccentric, and uncalculated tensing and then widening of the eyelids, and then the word, "Roberta." "What about her? What about her? Titus, what about her?" Silence. More of those nervous twitchings of the mouth, eyes, hands. Then, "Dead. She's been drowned." Followed by his complete collapse on the bench that stood just inside the door. And Mrs. Alden staring for a moment, at first not quite comprehending, then fully realizing, sinking heavily and without a word to the floor. And Titus looking at her and nodding his head as if to say, "Quite right. So should it be." Momentary escape for her from the contemplation of this horrible fact. And then slowly rising, going to her, kneeling beside her, straightening her out. Then the slowly going out to the door and around to the front of the house, where Orville Mason was seated on the broken front steps, contemplating speculatively, along with the afternoon sun in the west, the misery that this lorn and incompetent farmer was conveying to his wife, and wishing for the moment that it might be otherwise, that no such case, however profitable to himself, had arisen. But now, at sight of Titus Alden, he jumped up and preceded the skeleton-like figure into the lean-to, and finding Mrs. Alden, as small as her daughter nearly, and limp and still, he gathered her into his strong arms and carried her through the dining-room into the living-room, where stood an antiquated lounge on which he laid her. And there, feeling for her pulse, and then hurrying for some water, while he looked for someone, a son, daughter, neighbor, anyone, but not seeing anyone, hurrying back with the water to dash a little of it on her face and hands. "Is there a doctor anywhere near here?" He was addressing Titus, who was now kneeling by his wife. "In Bill's, yes. Dr. Crane." Has anyone around here a telephone?" "Mr. Wilcox." He pointed in the direction of the Wilcoxes, whose telephone Roberta had so recently used. "Just watch her. I'll be back." Forthwith he was out of the house, and away to call Crane or any other doctor, and then as swiftly returning with Mrs. Wilcox and her daughter, and then waiting, until first neighbors arrived, and then eventually Dr. Crane, with whom he consulted as to the advisability of discussing with Mrs. Alden yet this day the unescapable mystery which had brought him here. And Dr. Crane, very much impressed by Mr. Mason's solemn legal manner, admitting that it might even be best. And at last Mrs. Alden, treated with heroin, and crooned and mourned over by all present, being brought to the stage where it was possible, slowly and with much encouragement, to hear in the first place what the extenuating circumstances were, next being questioned concerning the identity of the cryptic individual referred to in Roberta's letter. The only person whom Mrs. Alden could recall as ever having been mentioned by Roberta as paying particular attention to her, and that but once, the Christmas before, was Clyde Griffiths, the nephew of the wealthy Samuel Griffiths of Lycurgus, and the manager of the department in which Roberta worked. But this in itself, as Mason and the Aldens themselves at once felt, was something which assuredly could not be taken to mean that the nephew of so great a man could be accused of the murder of Roberta. Wealth, position. Indeed, in the face of such an accusation, Mason was inclined to pause and consider, for the social difference between this man and this girl from his point of view seemed great. At that, it might be so. Why not? Was it not likely that a youth of such a secure position would possibly more than another, since she was so attractive, as Hyde had said, be the one to be paying casual and secret attention to a girl like Roberta? Did she not work in his uncle's factory, and was she not poor? Besides, as Fred Hyde had already explained, whoever it was that this girl was with at the time of her death, she had not hesitated to cohabit with him before marriage. And was that not part and parcel of a rich and sophisticated youth's attitude toward a poor girl? By reason of his own early buffetings at the mood of chance and established prosperity, the idea appealed to him intensely. The wretched rich, the indifferent rich. And here were her mother and father, obviously believing most firmly in her innocence and virtue. Further questioning of Mrs. Alden only brought out the fact that she'd never seen this particular youth, and had never even heard of any other. The only additional data that either she or her husband could furnish was that during her last homecoming of a month, Roberta had not been feeling at all well, drooped about the house and rested a good deal. Also that she'd written a number of letters, which she'd given to the postman or placed in the delivery box of the road crossing below. Neither Mr. nor Mrs. Alden knew to whom they were addressed, although the postman would be likely to know, as Mason quickly thought. Also, during this period, she'd been busy making some dresses, at least 4, and during the latter part of her stay she'd been the recipient of a number of telephone calls from a certain Mr. Baker, as Titus had heard Mr. Wilcox say. Also, on departing, she'd taken only such baggage as she'd brought with her, her small trunk and her bag. The trunk she'd checked herself at the station, but just where, other than Lycurgus, Titus could not say. But now, suddenly, since he was attaching considerable importance to the name Baker, there popped into Mason's mind Clifford Golden, Carl Graham, Clyde Griffiths. And at once the identity of the initials as well as the related euphony of the names gave him pause. An astounding coincidence, truly, if this same Clyde Griffiths had nothing to do with this crime. Immediately he was anxious to go direct to the mailman and question him. But since Titus Alden was important not only as a witness in identifying Roberta's body and the contents of the suitcase left by her at Gun Lodge, but also to persuade the postman to talk freely, he now asked him to dress and accompany him, assuring him that he would allow him to return tomorrow. After cautioning Mrs. Alden to talk to no one in regard to this, he now proceeded to the post office to question the mailman. That individual, when found, recalled upon inquiry, and in the presence of Titus, who stood like a galvanized corpse by the side of the district attorney, that not only had there been a few letters, no less than 12 or 15 even, handed him by Roberta during a recent stay here, but that all of them had been addressed to someone in Lycurgus by the name of, let him see, Clyde Griffiths, no less, care of general delivery there. Forthwith, the district attorney proceeded with him to a local notary's office, where a deposition was made, after which he called his office, and learning that Roberta's body had been brought to Bridgeburg, he drove there with as much speed as he could attain. And once there, and in the presence of the body, along with Titus, Burton Burley, Hyde, and Earl Newcomb, he was able to decide for himself, even while Titus, half demented, gazed upon the features of his child, first that she truly was Roberta Alden, and next as to whether he considered her of the type who would wantonly yield herself to such a liaison as the registration at Grass Lake seemed to indicate. He decided he did not. This was a case of sly, evil seduction as well as murder. Oh, the scoundrel! And still at large. Almost the political value of all this was obscured by an angry social resentfulness against men of means in general. But this particular contact with the dead, made at 10 o'clock at night in the receiving parlors of the Lutz brothers, undertakers, and with Titus Alden falling on his knees by the side of his daughter, and emotionally carrying her small cold hands to his lips, while he gazed feverishly and protestingly upon her waxy face, framed by her long brown hair, was scarcely such as to promise an unbiased or even legal opinion. The eyes of all those present were wet with tears, and now Titus Alden injected a new and most dramatic note into the situation. For while the Lutz brothers, with 3 of their friends who kept an automobile shop next door, Everett Beeker, the present representative of the Bridgeburg Republican, and Sam Taxon, the editor and publisher of the Democrat, awesomely gazed over or between the heads of each other from without a side door which gave into the Lutz's garage, he suddenly rose and, moving wildly toward Mason, exclaimed, "I want you to find the scoundrel who did this, Mr. District Attorney. I want him to be made to suffer as this pure good girl has been made to suffer. She's been murdered, that's all. No one but a murderer would take a girl out on a lake like that and strike her as anyone can see she's been struck." He gestured toward his dead child. "I have no money to help prosecute a scoundrel like that, but I will work. I will sell my farm." His voice broke, and seemingly was in danger of falling as he turned toward Roberta again. And now Orville Mason, swept into this father's stricken and yet retaliatory mood, pressed forward to exclaim, "Come away, Mr. Alden. We know this is your daughter. I swear all you gentlemen as witnesses to this identification, and if it shall be proved that this little girl of yours was murdered, as it now seems, I promise you, Mr. Alden, faithfully and dutifully, as the District Attorney of this county, that no time or money or energy on my part will be spared to track down this scoundrel and hale him before the proper authorities. And if the justice of Cataraqui County is what I think it is, you can leave him to any jury which our local court will summon, and you won't need to sell your farm either." Mr. Mason, because of his deep, if easily aroused emotion, as well as the presence of the thrilled audience, was in his most forceful as well as his very best oratorical mood. And one of the Lutz brothers, Ed, the recipient of all the county coroner's business, was moved to exclaim, "That's the ticket, Orville. You're the kind of a district attorney we like." And Everett Beeker now called out, "Go do it, Mr. Mason. We're with you to a man when it comes to that." And Fred Hyde, as well as his assistant, touched by Mason's dramatic stand, his very picturesque and even heroic appearance at the moment, now crowded closer, Hyde to take his friend by the hand, Earl to exclaim, "More power to you, Mr. Mason. We'll do all we can, you bet. And don't forget that bag that she left at Gun Lodge is over at your office. I gave it to Burton 2 hours ago." "That's right, too. I was almost forgetting that," exclaimed Mason, most calmly and practically at the moment, the previous burst of oratory and emotion having by now been somehow merged in his own mind with the exceptional burst of approval which up to this hour he had never experienced in any case with which previously he'd been identified. Chapter 5. As he proceeded to his office, accompanied by Alden and the officials in this case, his thought was running on the motive of this heinous crime. The motive. And because of his youthful sexual deprivations, his mind now tended continually to dwell on that. And meditating on the beauty and charm of Roberta, contrasted with her poverty and her strictly moral and religious upbringing, he was convinced that in all likelihood this man or boy, whoever he was, had seduced her, and then later, finding himself growing tired of her, had finally chosen this way to get rid of her, this deceitful alleged marriage trip to the lake. And at once he conceived an enormous personal hate for the man, the wretched rich, the idle rich, the wastrel and evil rich, a scion or representative of whom this young Clyde Griffiths was, if he could but catch him. At the same time, it now suddenly occurred to him that because of the peculiar circumstances attending this case, this girl cohabiting with this man in this way, she might be pregnant. And at once this suspicion was sufficient not only to make him sexually curious in regard to all the details of the life and courtship that had led to this, but also very anxious to substantiate for himself whether his suspicions were true. Immediately he began to think of a suitable doctor to perform an autopsy, if not here, then in Utica or Albany, also of communicating to Hyde his suspicions in the connection, and of having this, as well as the import of the blows upon her face, determined. But in regard to the bag and its contents, which was the immediate matter before him, he was fortunate in finding one additional bit of evidence of the greatest importance. For apart from the dresses and hats made by Roberta, her lingerie, a pair of red silk garters purchased at Braunstein's in Lycurgus, and still in their original box, there was a toilet set presented by Clyde to her the Christmas before, and with it the small plain white card on which Clyde had written, "For Bert from Clyde, Merry Christmas," but no family name, and the writing a hurried scrawl, since it had been written at a time when Clyde was most anxious to be elsewhere than with her. At once it occurred to Mason how odd that the presence of the toilet set in this bag, together with the card, should not have been known to the slayer. But if it were, and he had not removed the card, could it be possible that this same Clyde was the slayer? Would a man contemplating murder fail to see a card such as this with his own handwriting on it? What sort of a plotter and killer would that be? Immediately afterward he thought, supposing the presence of this card could be concealed until the day of the trial, and then suddenly produced, assuming the criminal denied any intimacy with the girl, or having given her any toilet set, and for the present he took the card and put it in his pocket, but not before Earl Newcomb, looking at it carefully, had observed, "I'm not positive, Mr. Mason, but that looks to me like the writing on the register up at Big Bittern." And at once Mason replied, "Well, it won't take long to establish the fact." He then signaled Hyde to follow him into an adjoining chamber, where, once alone with him, free from the observation and hearing of the others, he began, "Well, Fred, you see it was just as you thought. She did know who she was going with." He was referring to his own advice over the telephone from Biltz that Mrs. Alden had provided him with definite information as to the criminal. "But you couldn't guess in 1,000 years unless I told you." He leaned over and looked at Hyde shrewdly. "I don't doubt it, Orville. I haven't the slightest idea." "Well, you know of Griffiths and Company of Lycurgus?" "Not the collar people?" "Yes, the collar people." "Not the Sun?" Fred Hyde's eyes opened wider than they had in years. His wide brown hand grasped the end of his beard. "No, not the Son. A nephew." "Nephew? Of Samuel Griffiths? Not truly?" The old moral, religious, politic, commercial coroner stroked his beard again and stared. "The fact seems to point that way, Fred, now at least. I'm going down there yet tonight, though, and I hope to know a lot more tomorrow. But this Alden girl, they're the poorest kind of farm people, you know, worked for Griffiths and Company in Lycurgus, and this nephew, Clyde Griffiths, as I understand it, is in charge of the department in which she worked." Interjected the coroner. "She was home for a month, sick." He emphasized the word. "Just before she went on this trip last Tuesday, and during that time she wrote him at least 10 letters and maybe more. I got that from the rural delivery man. I have his affidavit here." He tapped his coat. "All addressed to Clyde Griffiths in Lycurgus. I even have his house number, and the name of the family with whom she lived. I telephoned down there from Biltz. I'm going to take the old man with me tonight, in case anything comes up that he might know about." Yes, Orville, I understand. I see. But Griffiths—" And once more he clucked with his tongue. "But what I want to talk to you about is the inquest," now went on Mason quickly and sharply. "You know, I've been thinking that it couldn't have been just because he didn't want to marry her that he wanted to kill her. That doesn't seem reasonable to me." And he added the majority of the thoughts that had caused him to conclude that Roberta was pregnant, and at once Hyde agreed with him. "Well, then, that means an autopsy," Mason resumed, "as well as medical opinion as to the nature of those wounds. We'll have to know beyond a shadow of a doubt, Fred, and before that body is taken away from here, whether that girl was killed before she was thrown out of that boat, or just stunned and then thrown out, or the boat upset. That's very vital to the case, as you know. We'll never be able to do anything unless we're positive about those things. But what about the medical men around here? Do you think any of them will be able to do all these things in a shipshape way, so that what they say will hold water in court?" Mason was dubious. Already he was building his case. "Well, as to that, Orville," Ike replied slowly, "I can't say exactly. You'd be a better judge, maybe, than I would. I've already asked Dr. Mitchell to step over tomorrow and take a look at her. Also Betts. But if there's any other doctor you'd rather have, Bavo or Lincoln of Coldwater, how about Bavo?" "I'd rather have Webster of Utica," went on Mason, "or Bemis, or both. 4 or 5 opinions in a case like this won't be any too many." And Haight, sensing the importance of the great responsibility now resting on him, added, "Well, I guess you're right, Orville. Maybe 4 or 5 would be better than 1 or 2. That means, though, that the inquest will have to be postponed for a day or 2 more till we get these men here." "Quite right, quite right," went on Mason. "But that will be a good thing, too, as long as I'm going down to Lycurgus tonight to see what I can find out. You never can tell. I may catch up with him. I hope so somehow, or if not that, then I may come upon something that'll throw some extra light on this. For this is going to be a big thing, Fred. I can see that. The most difficult case that ever came my way or yours either. And we can't be too careful as to how we move from now on. He's likely to be rich, you see, and if he is, he'll fight. Besides, there's that family down there to back him up." He ran a nervous hand through his shock of hair, then added, "Well, that's all right, too. The next thing to do is to get Bemis and Webster of Utica. Better wire them tonight, or call them up. And Sproul of Albany. And then to keep peace in the family around here, perhaps we'd better have Lincoln and Betts over here. And maybe Balfour." He permitted himself the faintest shadow of a smile. "In the meantime, I'll be going along, Fred. Arranged to have them come up Monday or Tuesday instead of tomorrow. I expect to be back by then, and if so, I can be with you. If you can, better get 'em up here Monday. See? The quicker the better, and we'll see what we know by then." He went to a drawer to secure some extra writs, and then into the outer room to explain to Alden the trip that was before him, and to have Burley call up his wife, to whom he explained the nature of his work and haste, and that he might not be back before Monday. And all the way down to Utica, which took 3 hours, as well as the wait of 1 hour before a train for Lycurgus could be secured, and an additional hour and 20 minutes on that train, which set them down at about 7, Orville Mason was busy extracting from the broken and gloomy Titus, as best he could, excerpts from his own as well as Roberta's humble past, her generosity, loyalty, virtue, sweetness of heart, and the places and conditions under which previously she had worked, and what she'd received, and what she'd done with the money. A humble story which he was quite able to appreciate. Arriving at Lycurgus with Titus by his side, he made his way as quickly as possible to the Lycurgus house, where he took a room for the father in order that he might rest, and after that to the office of the local district attorney, from whom he must obtain authority to proceed, as well as an officer who would execute his will for him here. And then, being supplied with a stalwart detective in plain clothes, he proceeded to Clyde's room in Taylor Street, hoping against hope that he might find him there. But Mrs. Peyton appearing and announcing that Clyde lived there, but that at present he was absent, having gone the Tuesday before to visit friends at 12th Lake, she believed, he was rather painfully compelled to announce first that he was the district attorney of Cataraqui County, and next that because of certain suspicious circumstances in connection with the drowning of a girl in Big Bittern, with whom they had reason to believe that Clyde was at the time, they would now be compelled to have access to his room, a statement which so astonished Mrs. Peyton that she fell back, an expression of mixed amazement, horror, and unbelief overspreading her features. "Not Mr. Clyde Griffiths? Oh, how ridiculous! Why, he's the nephew of Mr. Samuel Griffiths, and very well known here. I'm sure they can tell you all about him at their residence if you must know. But anything like, oh, impossible!" And she looked at both Mason and the local detective, who was already displaying his official badge, as though she doubted both their honesty and authority. At the same time, the detective, being all too familiar with such circumstances, had already placed himself beyond Mrs. Peyton at the foot of the stairs leading to the floor above, and Mason now drew from his pocket a writ of search, which he'd been careful to secure. "I'm sorry, madam, but I'm compelled to ask you to show us his room. This is a search warrant, and this officer here is at my direction." And at once, struck by the futility of contending with the law, she now nervously indicated Clyde's room, feeling still that some insane and most unfair and insulting mistake was being made. But the two having proceeded to Clyde's room, they began to look here and there. At once both noted one small and not very strong trunk, locked and standing in one corner, which Mr. Faunce, the detective, immediately began to lift to decide upon its weight and strength, while Mason began to examine each particular thing in the room, the contents of all drawers and boxes, as well as the pockets of all clothes, and in the chiffonier drawers, along with some discarded underwear and shirts, and a few old invitations from the Trumbles, Starks, Griffiths, and Harriets. He now found a memorandum sheet which Clyde had carried home from his desk, and on which he'd written, "Wednesday, February 20th, dinner at Stark's," and below that, "Friday, 22nd, Trumbles." And this handwriting Mason at once compared with that on the card in his pocket, and being convinced by the similarity that he was in the room of the right man, he took the invitations and then looked toward the trunk which the detective was now contemplating. "What about this, Chief? Will you take it away or open it here?" "I think," said Mason solemnly, "we'd better open that right here, Faunce. I'll send for it afterwards, but I want to see what's in it now." And at once the detective extracted from his pocket a heavy chisel, while he began looking around for a hammer. "It isn't very strong," he said. "I think I can kick it open, if you say so." At this point Mrs. Peyton, most astounded by these developments, and anxious to avoid any such rough procedure, exclaimed, "You can have a hammer if you wish, but why not wait and send for a keyman? Why, I never heard of such a thing in all my life." However, the detective having secured the hammer and jarred the lock loose, there lay revealed in a small top crate various unimportant odds and ends of Clyde's wardrobe: socks, collars, ties, a muffler, suspenders, a discarded sweater, a pair of not-too-good high-top winter shoes, a cigarette-holder, a red lacquer ashtray, and a pair of skates. But in addition among these, in the corner in one compact bundle, the final 15 letters of Roberta, written him from Bouts, together with a small picture of herself given him the year before, as well as another small bundle consisting of all the notes and invitations written him by Sandra up to the time she had departed for Pine Point. The letters written from there Clyde had taken with him, laid next his heart, and even more incriminating, a third bundle consisting of 11 letters from his mother, the first two addressed to Harry Tennant, care of General Delivery, Chicago, a most suspicious circumstance on the surface, whereas the others of the bundle were addressed to Clyde Griffiths, not only care of the Union League, Chicago, but to Lycurgus. Without waiting further to see what else the trunk might contain, the district attorney began opening these and reading. First 3 from Roberta, after which the reason she'd gone to Bouts was made perfectly plain, then the 3 first letters from his mother, on most pathetically commonplace stationery as he could see, hinting at the folly of the life as well as the nature of the accident that had driven him from Kansas City, and at the same time advising him most solicitously and tenderly as to the proper path for his feet in the future, the general effect of which was to convey to a man of Mason's repressed temperament and limited social experience the impression that from the very beginning this individual had been of a loose, wayward, and errant character. At the same time, and to his surprise, he now learned that except for what his rich uncle might have done for him here, Clyde was obviously of a poor as well as highly religious branch of the Griffiths family, and while ordinarily this might have influenced him in Clyde's favor a little, still now, in view of the notes of Sandra, as well as the pathetic letters of Roberta and his mother's reference to some earlier crime in Kansas City, he was convinced that not only was Clyde of such a disposition as could plot such a crime, but also one who could execute it in cold blood. That crime in Kansas City. He must wire the district attorney there for particulars. And with this thought in mind, he now scanned, more briefly, but none the less sharply and critically, the various notes or invitations or love messages from Sandra, all on heavily perfumed and monogrammed stationery, which grew more and more friendly and intimate as the correspondence progressed, until toward the last they invariably began, "Clydey, midey," or "Sweetest black eyes," or "My sweetest boy," and were signed Sonda, or "Your own Sandra," and some of them dated so recently as May 10th, May 15th, May 26th, or up to the very time at which, as he instantly noted, Roberta's most doleful letters began to arrive. It was all so plain now. One secretly betrayed girl in the background, while he had the effrontery to ingratiate himself into the affections of another, this time, obviously, one of much higher social position here. Although fascinated and staggered by this interesting development, he at the same time realized that this was no hour in which to sit meditating. Far from it. This trunk must be transferred at once to his hotel. Later he must go forth to find out, if he could, exactly where this individual was, and arrange for his capture. And while he ordered the detective to call up the police department and arrange for the transfer of the trunk to his room at the Lycurgus house, he hurried next to the residence of Samuel Griffiths, only to learn that no member of the family was then in the city. They were all at Greenwood Lake. But a telephone message to that place brought the information that, insofar as they knew, this same Clyde Griffiths, their nephew, was at the Cranston Lodge on 12th Lake near Sharon, adjoining the Finchley Lodge. The name Finchley, together with the town of Sharon, being already identified in Mason's mind with Clyde, he at once decided that if he was still anywhere in this region he would be there, at the summer home perhaps of this girl who'd written him the various notes and invitations he'd seen, this Sandra Finchley. Also, had not the captain of the Cygnus declared that he'd seen a youth who'd come down from Fremont Bay to bark there? Eureka! He had him! And at once, after meditating sharply on the wisdom of his course, he decided to proceed to Sharon and Pine Point himself. But in the meantime, being furnished with an accurate description of Clyde, he now furnished this as well as the fact that he was wanted for murder, not only to the district attorney and the chief of police of Lycurgus, but to Newton Slack, the sheriff at Bridgeburg, as well as to Height and his own assistant, urging all three to proceed at once to Sharon, where he would meet them. At the same time, speaking as though for Mrs. Peyton, he now called upon the long-distance telephone at the Cranston Lodge at Pine Point, and, getting the butler on the wire, inquired whether Mr. Clyde Griffiths chanced to be there. "Yes, sir, he is, sir, but he's not here now, sir. I think he's on a camping party farther up the lake, sir. Any message, sir?" And in response to further inquiries, he replied that he could not say exactly. A party had gone presumably to Bear Lake, some 30 miles farther up, but when it would return he could not say. Not likely before a day or two, but distinctly this same Clyde was with that party. And at once Mason recalled the sheriff at Bridgeburg, instructing him to take 4 or 5 deputies with him, so that the searching party might divide at Sharon and seize this same Clyde wherever he chanced to be, and throw him in jail at Bridgeburg, where he could explain, with all due process of law, the startling circumstances that thus far seemed to unescapably point to him as the murderer of Roberta Alden. Chapter 6. In the interim, the mental state of Clyde since that hour when, the water closing over Roberta, he'd made his way to the shore, and then, after changing his clothes, had subsequently arrived at Sharon and the lakeside lodge of the Cranstons, was almost one of complete mental derangement, mainly caused by fear and confusion in his own mind as to whether he did or did not bring about her untimely end. At the same time, at the lakeside, the realization that if by any chance he were then and there found, skulking south rather than returning north to the inn at Big Bittern to report this seeming accident, there would be sufficient hardness and cruelty to the look of it all to convince anyone that a charge of murder should be made against him, had fiercely tortured him. For as he now saw it, he really was not guilty, was he, since at the last moment he had experienced that change of heart? But who was going to believe that now, since he did not go back to explain? And it would never do to go back now. or if Saunders should hear that he'd been on this lake with this factory girl, that he had registered with her as husband and wife, God! And then trying to explain to his uncle afterwards, or his cold, hard cousin, or all those smart, cynical, like Kyrgyz people. No. Having gone so far, he must go on. Disaster, if not death, lay in the opposite direction. He would have to make the best of this terrible situation, make the best of this plan that had ended so strangely and somewhat exculpatorily for him. And yet these woods, this approaching night, the eerie loneliness and danger of it all now. How now to do, what to say, if met by anyone? He was so confused, mentally and nervously sick. The crackle of a twig, and he leaped forward as a hare. And in this state it was that after having recovered his bag and changed his clothes, wringing out his wet suit and attempting to dry it, then packing it in his bag under some dry twigs and pine needles, and burying the tripod beneath a rotting log, that he plunged into the woods after night had fallen, yet meditating more and more on his very strange and perilous position, or supposing, just as he had unintentionally struck at her, and they had fallen into the water, and she uttered those piercing and appealing cries, there had been someone on the shore, someone watching, one of those strong, hardy men whom he'd seen loitering about during the day, and who might even at this moment be sounding a local alarm that would bring a score of such men to the work of hunting for him this very night. A manhunt, and they would take him back, and no one would ever believe that he had not intentionally struck her. They might even lynch him before he could so much as secure a fair trial. It was possible. It had been done. A rope around his neck, or shot down in these woods, maybe, and without an opportunity to explain how it had all come about, how harried and tortured he'd been by her for so long. They would never understand that, and so thinking he hurried faster and faster, as fast as strong and serried and brambly young firs and dead branches that cracked most ominously at times would permit, thinking always as he went that the road to 3 Mile Bay must be to his right hand, the moon to his left when it should rise. But God, what was that? Oh, that terrible sound! Like a whimpering, screeching spirit in this dark. There, what was it? He dropped his bag, and in a cold sweat sunk down, crouching behind a tall, thick tree, rigid and motionless with fear. That sound! But only a screech owl. He'd heard it several weeks before at the Cranston Lodge. But here, in this wood, this dark, he must be getting on and out of here. There was no doubt of that. He must not be thinking such horrible, fearful thoughts, or he would not be able to keep up his strength or courage at all. But that look in the eyes of Roberta, that last appealing look, God, he could not keep from seeing it. Her mournful, terrible screams. Could he not cease from hearing them until he got out of here anyhow? Had she understood when he struck her that it was not intentional, a mere gesture of anger and protest? Did she know that now, wherever she was, in the bottom of the lake, or here in the dark of these woods beside him, mayhap? Ghosts, hers. But he must get out of this, out of this. He must, and yet the safety of these woods, too. He must not be too brash in stepping out into any road, either. Pedestrians, people in search of him, maybe. But did people really live after death? Were there ghosts, and did they know the truth? Then she must know. But how he plotted before that, too. And what would she think of that? And was she here now, reproachfully and gloomily pursuing him with mistaken accusations? As true as it might be that he had intended to kill her at first, he had. He had. And that was the great sin, of course. Even though he had not killed her, yet something had done it for him. That was true. But ghosts, God, spirits that might pursue you after they were dead, seeking to expose and punish you, seeking to set people on your track, maybe. Who could tell? His mother had confessed to him, and Frank and Esther and Julia, that she believed in ghosts. And then at last the moon, after 3 such hours of stumbling, listening, waiting, perspiring, trembling. No one in sight now, thank God. and the stars overhead, bright and yet soft, as at Pine Point where Sandra was. If she could see him now, slipping away from Roberta dead in that lake, his own hat upon the waters there. If she could have heard Roberta's cries, how strange that never, never, never would he be able to tell her that because of her, her beauty, his passion for her, and all that she'd come to mean to him, he'd been able to, well, attempt this terrible thing, kill a girl whom once he had loved. And all his life he would have this with him now, this thought. He would never be able to shake it off. Never, never, never. And he'd not thought of that before. It was a terrible thing in its way, just that, wasn't it? But then suddenly, there in the dark, at about 11 o'clock, as he afterwards guessed, the water having stopped his watch, and after he'd reached the high road to the west, and walked a mile or two, those three men, quick, like ghosts coming out of the shadow of the woods. He thought at first that having seen him at the moment he'd struck Roberta, or the moment afterward, they'd now come to take him. The sweating horror of that moment, and that boy who'd held up the light the better to see his face, and no doubt he had evinced most suspicious fear and perturbation, since at the moment he was most deeply brooding on all that had happened, terrorized really by the thought that somehow, in some way, he'd left some clue that might lead directly to him, and he did jump back, feeling that these were men sent to seize him. But at that moment the foremost, a tall, bony man, without appearing to be more than amused at his obvious cowardice, had called, "Howdy, stranger," while the youngest, without appearing to be suspicious at all, had stepped forward and then turned up the light. And it was then that he'd begun to understand that they were just countrymen or guides, not a posse in pursuit of him, and that if he were calm and civil, they would have no least suspicion that he was the murderer that he was. But afterward he'd said to himself, "But they will remember me, walking along this lonely road at this hour with this bag, won't they?" And so at once he decided that he must hurry, and not be seen by any others anywhere there. Then, hours later, and just as the moon was lowering toward the west, a sickly yellow pallor overspreading the woods and making the night even more wretched and wearisome, he'd come to 3 Mile Bay itself, a small collection of native and summer cottages nestling at the northernmost end of what was known as the Indian Chain, and in it, as he could see from a bend in the road, a few pale lights still twinkling, stores, houses, street lamps, but all dim in the pale light, so dim and eerie to him. One thing was plain. At this hour, and dressed as he was, and with his bag in his hand, he could not enter there. That would be to fix curiosity as well as suspicion on him, assuredly, if anyone was still about. In the cassette number 2, side 1. To continue, please turn the cassette over. Cassette number 2, side 2, of An American Tragedy, Part 2. As the launch that ran between this place and Sharon, from whence he would proceed to Pine Point, did not leave until 8:30, he must hide away in the meantime, and make himself as presentable as possible. And accordingly, re-entering a thicket of pines that ascended to the very borders of the town, there to wait until morning, being able to tell by a small clock face which showed upon the sides of a small church tower when the hour for emerging had arrived, but in the interim debating, was it wise so to do, or who might not be here to wait for him? Those 3 men, or someone else who might have seen, or an officer notified from somewhere else? Yet deciding after a time that it was best to do just the same, or to stalk along in the woods west of this lake, and by night rather than day, seeing that by day he might be seen, and when by taking this boat he could reach in an hour and a half, or 2 hours at the most, the Cranston Lodge at Sharon, whereas by walking he would not arrive until tomorrow, was not that unwise, more dangerous? Besides, he'd promised Sandra and Bertine that he would be there Tuesday, and here it was Friday. Again, by tomorrow, might not a hue and cry be on, his description sent here and there, whereas this morning, well, how could Roberta have been found as yet? No, better this way, or who knew him here, or who could identify him as yet with either Carl Graham or Clifford Golden? Best go this way, speedily, before anything else in connection with her developed. Yes, yes. And finally the clock hands pointing to 8:10, making his way out, his heart beating heavily as he did so. At the foot of this street was the launch with steam from here to Sharon, and as he loitered he observed the bus from Raquette Lake approaching. It now occurred to him that if he encountered anyone he knew on the steamer, dock, or boat, could he not say that he was fresh from Raquette Lake, where Sandra as well as Bertine had many friends, or in case they themselves came down on the boat, that he'd been there the day before? What matter whose name or lodge he mentioned, and invented one if need be? And so at last making his way to the boat and boarding it, and later at Sharon, leaving it again, and without, as he thought, appearing to attract any particular attention at either end, for although there were some 11 passengers, all strangers to him, still no one other than a young country girl in a blue dress and a white straw hat, who he guessed to be from this vicinity, appeared to pay any particular attention to him, and her glances were admiring rather than otherwise, although sufficient, because of his keen desire for secrecy, to cause him to retire to the rear of the boat, whereas the others appeared to prefer the forward deck. And once in Sharon, knowing that the majority were making for the railway station to catch the first morning train down, he followed briskly in their wake, only to turn into the nearest lunchroom in order to break the trail, as he hoped. For although he'd walked a long distance from Big Bittern to 3 Mile Bay, and previously had rowed all afternoon, and merely made a pretense of eating the lunch which Roberta had prepared at Grass Lake, still even now he was not hungry. Then, seeing a few passengers approaching from the station, yet none whom he knew, he joined these again, as though just coming to the inn and launched from the train. For at this time there had come to him the thought that this south train from Albany, as well as Utica being due here at this hour, it was only natural that he should seem to come on that. Pretending first, therefore, to be going to the station, yet stopping en route to telephone Bertine and Sandra that he was here, and being assured that a car rather than a launch would be sent for him, he explained that he would be waiting on the west veranda of the inn. En route also he stopped at a newsstand for a morning paper, although he knew there could be nothing in it as yet. And he'd barely crossed to the veranda of the inn and seated himself before the Cranston car approached, and in response to the greeting of the Cranston family chauffeur, whom he knew well, and who smiled most welcomingly, he was now able to achieve a seemingly easy and genial smile, though still inwardly troubled by his great dread. For no doubt by now, as he persistently argued with himself, the 3 men whom he'd met had reached Big Bittern, and by now both Roberta and he must assuredly have been missed, and maybe, who knows, the upturned boat with his hat and her veil discovered. If so, might they not have already reported that they'd seen such a man as himself carrying a bag and making his way to the south in the night? And if so, would not that, regardless of whether the body was found or not, cause them to become dubious as to whether a double drowning had occurred? And supposing by some strange chance her body should come to the surface, then what? And might there not be a mark left by that hard blow he'd given her? If so, would they not suspect murder, and his body not coming up, and those men describing the man they'd seen? Would not Clifford Golden or Carl Graham be suspected of murder? But neither Clifford Golden nor Carl Graham were Clyde Griffiths by any means, and they could not possibly identify Clyde Griffiths with either Clifford Golden or Carl Graham. For had he not taken every precaution, even searching through Roberta's bag and purse there at Grass Lake, while at his request after breakfast she'd gone back to see about the lunch? Had he not? True, he'd found those 2 letters from that girl, Teresa Bowser, addressed to Roberta at Bill's, and he destroyed them before ever leaving for Gun Lodge. And as for that toilet set in its original case, with a label whitely like Kirgis on it, while it was true that he'd been compelled to leave that, still might not anyone, Mrs. Clifford Golden or Mrs. Carl Graham, have bought that in Whiteley's, and so without the possibility of its being traced to him? Assuredly. And as for her clothes, even assuming that they did go to prove her identity, would it not be assumed by her parents as well as others that she'd gone on this trip with a strange man by the name of Golden or Graham? And would they not want that hushed up without further ado? At any rate, he would hope for the best, keep up his nerve, put on a strong, pleasant, cheerful front here, so that no one would think of him as the one, since he'd not actually killed her anyhow. Here he was in this fine car, and Sandra as well as Bertine waiting for him. He would have to say that he was just up from Albany, had been on some errand over there for his uncle, which had taken all of his time since Tuesday. And while he should be blissfully happy with Sandra, still here were all of those dreadful things of which now all of the time he would be compelled to think. The danger that in some inadvertent way he'd not quite covered all the tracks that might lead to him. And if he'd not, exposure, arrest, perhaps a hasty and unjust conviction, punishment even, unless he was able to explain about that accidental blow. The end of all his dreams in connection with Sandra, like Kyrgyz, the great life that he'd hoped for himself. But could he explain as to that? Could he? God! Chapter 7. From Friday morning until the following Tuesday noon, moving amid such scenes as previously had so exhilarated and enthralled him, Clyde was now compelled to suffer the most frightful fears and dreads. For although met by Sandra as well as Bertine at the door of the Cranston Lodge, and shown by them to the room he was to occupy, he could not help but contrast every present delight here with the danger of his immediate and complete destruction. As he'd entered, Sandra had poutingly whispered, so that Bertine might not hear, "Betty, staying down there a whole week when you might have been up here, and Sandra planning everything for you. You ought to have a good spanking. I was going to call up today to see where you were." Yet at the same time her eyes conveying the infatuation that now dominated her. And he, in spite of his troubled thoughts, achieving a gay smile, for once in her presence, even the terror of Roberta's death, his own present danger appeared to dwindle. If only all went well now, nothing were traced to him, a clear path, a marvelous future, her beauty, her love, her wealth. And yet, after being ushered to his room, his bag having been carried in before him, at once becoming nervous as to the suit. It was damp and wrinkled. He must hide it on one of the upper shelves of the closet, maybe. And the moment he was alone and the door locked, taking it out, wet and wrinkled, the mud of the shores of Big Bittern still about the lakes, yet deciding perhaps not. Perhaps he'd better keep it locked in his bag until night, when he could better decide what to do. Yet tying up in a single bundle, in order to have them laundered, other odds and ends he'd worn that day, and as he did so, terribly, sickeningly conscious of the mystery and drama, as well as the pathos of his life, all he had contacted since his arrival in the East, how little he'd had in his youth, how little he had now, really. The spaciousness and grandeur of this room, as contrasted with the one he occupied in Lycurgus, the strangeness of his being here at all after yesterday, the blue waters of this bright lake without, as contrasted with the darker ones of Big Bittern, and on the greensward that reached from this bright, strong, rambling house, with its wide veranda and striped awnings to the shore of the lake itself, Stuart Finchley and Violet Taylor, together with Frank Harriot and Wynette Fant, in the smartest of sport clothes playing tennis, while Bertine and Harley Baggett lolled in the shade of the striped marquee swing, and he himself, after bathing and dressing, assuming a jocular air, although his nerves remained tense and his mood apprehensive, and then descending to where Sandra and Bertram Taylor and Jill Trumbull were laughing over some amusing experiences in connection with motorboating the day before. Jill Trumbull called to him as he came out, "Hello, Clyde. Been playing hooky or what? I haven't seen you, and I don't know when." And he, after smiling wistfully at Sandra, craving as never before her sympathy as well as her affection, drawing himself up on the railing of the veranda and replying as smoothly as he could, "Been working over at Albany since Tuesday. Hot down there. It's certainly fine to be up here today. Who's all up?" And Jill Trumbull smiling, "Oh, nearly everyone, I guess. I saw Vanda over at the Randalls yesterday. And Scott wrote Bertine he was coming to the Point next Tuesday. It looks to me as though no one was going over to Greenwood much this year." And then a long and intense discussion as to why Greenwood was no longer what it had been, and then Sandra exclaiming, "That reminds me. I have to phone Bella today. She promised to come up to that horse show over at Bristol week after next. Sure." And then more talk of horses and dogs, and Clyde listening intently in his anxiety to seem an integral part of it all, and yet brooding on all that so desperately concerned him. Those 3 men. Roberta. Maybe they'd found her body by now. Who could tell, yet saying to himself, why so fearsome? Was it likely that in that depth of water, 50 feet maybe for all he knew, that they would find her, or that they could ever identify him with Clifford Golden or Carl Graham? How could they? Hadn't he really and truly covered his tracks except for those 3 men? Those 3 men. He shivered, as with cold in spite of himself. And then Sandra, sensing a note of depression about him. She determined from his obvious lack of equipment on his first visit that perhaps the want of money was at the bottom of his present mood, and so proposed later this day to extract $75 from her purse and force that upon him in order that at no point where petty expenditures should be required should he feel the least bit embarrassed during his stay this time. And after a few moments, thinking of the short golf course, with its variety of concealed hazards for unseen kisses and embraces, she now jumped up with, "Who's for a mixed foursome? Come on, Jill. Clyde, Birch. I'll bet Clyde and I can turn in a lower card than you two can." "I'll take that," exclaimed Birchard Taylor, rising and straightening his yellow and blue striped sweater. "Even if I didn't get in until 4 this morning. How about you, Jilly? If you want to make that for the lunches, Sonny, I'll take it." And at once Clyde wincing and chilling, for he was thinking of the miserable $25 left him from all his recent ghastly adventures. And a lunch for 4 here would cost not less than $8 or $10, perhaps more. At the same time Sandra, noting his expression, exclaimed, "That's a go," and drawing near to Clyde, tapped him gently with her toe, exclaiming, "But I have to change. I'll be right down. In the meantime, Clyde, I'll tell you what you do. Go and find Andrew and tell him to get the clubs, will you? We can go over in your boat, can't we, Birchie?" And Clyde, hurrying to find Andrew, and thinking of the probable cost of the lunch if he and Sandra were defeated, but being caught up with by Sandra and seized by the arm. "Wait a minute, honey. I'll be right back." Then dashing up the steps to her room, and in a moment down again, a handful of bills she had reserved shut tightly in her little fist. "Here, darling, quick," she whispered, taking hold of one of Clyde's coat pockets and putting the money into it. "Shh, not a word now. Hurry. It's to pay for the lunch in case we lose, and some other things. I'll tell you afterwards. Oh, but I do love you, baby boy." And then her warm brown eyes fixed on him for a moment in profound admiration, dashing up the stairs again from where she called, "Don't stand there, silly. Get the golf clubs, the golf clubs." And she was gone. And Clyde, feeling his pocket and realizing that she'd given him much, plenty, no doubt, for all of his needs while here, as well as to escape if need be, and exclaiming to himself, "Darling, baby girl." His beautiful, warm, generous Sandra. She loved him so, truly loved him. But if ever she should find out, oh, God! And yet all for her, if she only knew, all for her. And then finding Andrew and returning with him carrying the bags. And here was Sandra again, dancing down in a smart green knitted sports costume, and Jill in a new cap and blouse, which made her look like a jockey, laughing at Birchard, who was at the wheel of the boat, and Sandra calling back to Bertine and Harley Baggett in the swing as she was passing, "Hey, fellas, you won't come, eh?" "Where?" "Casino Golf Club." "Oh, too far. See you after lunch on the beach, though." And then Birchard shooting the boat out in the lake with a whir that set it bounding like a porpoise, and Clyde gazing half in a dream, half delight and hope, and the other half a cloud of shadow and terror, with arrest and death, maybe, stalking close behind. For in spite of all his preliminary planning, he was beginning to feel that he'd made a mistake in openly coming out of the wood this morning. And yet had it not been best, since the only alternative was that of remaining there by day and coming out at night, and following the shore road on foot to Sharon? That would have required 2 or 3 days, and Sandra, anxious as well as curious about the delay, might have telephoned to Lycurgus, thereby raising some question in regard to him, which might have proved dangerous later, might it not? But here now, this bright day, with seemingly no cares of any kind, for these others at least, however dark and bleak his own background might be, and Sandra all gaiety because of his presence, now jumping up, her bright scarf held aloft in one hand like a pennant, and exclaiming foolishly and gaily, "Cleopatra sailing to meet. Who was it she was sailing to meet, anyhow?" "Charlie Chaplin," volunteered Taylor, at the same time proceeding to ricochet the boat as roughly and erratically as possible, in order to make her lose her balance. "Oh, you silly," returned Sandra, spreading her feet sufficiently apart to maintain her equilibrium, and adding for the benefit of Burchard, "No, you don't either, Birchie." Then continuing, "Cleopatra sailing, ah-oh, I know, aquaplaning," and throwing her head back and her arms wide, while the boat continued to jump and lurch like a frightened horse. "See if you could upset me now, Birchie," she called, and Burchard, throwing the boat from side to side as swiftly as he dared, with Jill Trumbull anxious for her own safety, calling, "Oh, say, what do you want to do, drown us all?" At which Clyde winced and blanched as though struck. At once he felt sick, weak. He'd never imagined that it was going to be like this, that he was going to suffer so. He had imagined that it was all going to be different, and yet here he was, blanching at every accidental and unintended word. Why, if he were put to any real test, an officer descending on him unexpectedly and asking him where he'd been yesterday and what he knew of Roberta's death, why, he would mumble, shiver, not be able to talk, maybe, and so give his whole case away, wouldn't he? He must brace up, try to look natural, happy, mustn't he, for this first day at least. Fortunately, in the speed and excitement of the play, the others seemed not to notice the startling effect of the remark upon him, and he managed by degrees to recover his outward composure. Then the launch approached the casino, and Sandra, wishing to execute some last showy stunt, jumped up and, catching the rail, pulled herself up, while the boat rolled past, only to reverse later. And Clyde, because of a happy smile in his direction, was seized by an uncontrollable desire for her love, sympathy, generosity, courage. And so now, to match her smiles, he jumped up, and after assisting Jill to the steps, quickly climbed up after her, pretending a gaiety and enthusiasm that was as hollow inwardly as outwardly it was accurate. "Gee, some athlete you are!" And then on the links a little later with her, and under her guidance and direction, playing as successful a game as it was possible with his little experience and as troubled as he was, and she, because of the great delight of having him all to herself in shadowy hazards where they might kiss and embrace, beginning to tell him of a proposed camping trip which she, Frank Harriet, Lynette Fant, Burchard Taylor, her brother Stuart, Grant Cranston, and Bertine, as well as Harley Baggett, Pearlie Haynes, Jill Trumbull, and Violet Taylor, had been organizing for a week, and which was to begin on the morrow afternoon, with a motor trip 30 miles up the lake, and then 40 miles east to a lake known as Bear, along which, with tents and equipment, they were to canoe to certain beaches and scenes known only to Harley and Frank. Different days, different points. The boys would kill squirrels and catch fish for food. Also, there would be moonlight trips to an inn that could be reached by boat, so they said. A servant or 2 or 3 from different homes was to accompany them, as well as a chaperone or 2. But oh, the walks in the woods, the opportunities for love, canoe trips on the lake, hours of uninterrupted love-making for at least a week. In spite of all that had occurred thus far to give him pause, he could not help thinking that whatever happened, was it not best to go? How wonderful to have her love him so! And what else here could he do? It would take him out of this, would it not? Farther and farther from the scene of the accident, and in case anyone were looking for anyone who looked like him, for instance, well, he would not be around where he could be seen and commented upon. Those 3 men. Yet, as it now instantly occurred to him, under no circumstances must he leave here without first finding out as definitely as possible whether anyone was as yet suspected. And once at the casino, and for the moment left alone, he learned on inquiring at the newsstand that there would be no Albany, Utica, or any local afternoon paper there until 7 or 7:30. He must wait until then to know. And so, although after the lunch there was swimming and dancing, then a return to the Cranstons with Harley Baggett and Bertine, Sandra going to Pine Point, with an agreement to meet him afterwards at the Harriets for dinner. Still his mind was on the business of getting these papers at the first possible opportunity. Yet unless, as he now saw, he was so fortunate as to be able to stop on his way from the Cranstons to the Harriets, and so obtain one or all, he must manage to come over to this casino in the morning before leaving for Bear Lake. He must have them. He must know what, if anything, was either being said or done, so far in regard to that drowned couple. But on his way to Harriet's he was not able to get the papers. They had not come, and none at the Harriet's either when he first arrived. Yet sitting on the veranda about half an hour later, talking with the others, although brooding as to all this, Sandra herself appeared and said, "Oh, say, people, I've got something to tell you. 2 people were drowned this morning or yesterday up at Big Bittern, so Blanche Locke was telling me just now over the phone. She's up at 3 Mile Bay today, and she says they found the body of the girl, but not the man yet. They were drowned in the south part of the lake somewhere, she said." At once Clyde sat up, rigid and white, his lips a bloodless line, his eyes fixed not on anything here, but rather the distant scene at Big Bittern, the tall pines, the dark water closing over Roberta. Then they'd found her body, and now would they believe that his body was down there too, as he'd planned? But listen, he must hear in spite of his dizziness. "Gee, that's tough," observed Burchard Taylor, stopping his strumming on a mandolin. "Anybody we know?" "She says she didn't hear yet." "I never did like that lake," put in Frank Harriet. "It's too lonely. Dad and I and Mr. Randall were up there fishing last summer, but we didn't stay long. It's too gloomy." "We were up there 3 weeks ago. Don't you remember, Sandra?" added Harley Baggett. "You didn't care for it." "Yes, I remember," replied Sandra. "A dreadfully lonely place. I can't imagine anyone wanting to go up there for anything." "Well, I only hope it isn't anyone we know from round here," added Burchard thoughtfully. "It would put a crimp in the fun around here for a while, anyhow." And Clyde unconsciously wet his dry lips with his tongue, and swallowed to moisten his already dry throat. "I don't suppose any of today's papers would have anything about it yet. Has anyone looked?" inquired Wynette Fant, who had not heard Sandra's opening remark. "There ain't no papers," commented Burchard Taylor. "Besides, it's not likely yet. Didn't Sandra say she just heard it from Blanche Locke over the phone? She's up near there." "Oh, yes, that's right." And yet might not that small local afternoon paper of Sharon, the Banner, wasn't it, have something as to this? If only he could see it yet tonight. But another thought, for heaven's sake. It came to him now for the first time. His footprints. Were there any in the mud of that shore? He had not even stopped to look, climbing out so hastily as he did. And might there not have been? And then would they not know and proceed to follow him? The man those 3 men saw, Clifford Golden, that ride down this morning, is going out to the Cranstons in their car, that wet suit over in the room at the Cranstons. Had anyone in his absence been in his room as yet to look, examine, inquire, open his bag, maybe? An officer? God! It was there in his bag. But why in his bag or anywhere else near him now? Why had he not hidden it before this? Thrown it in the lake here, maybe, with a stone in it. That would keep it down. God! What was he thinking in the face of such a desperate situation as this? Supposing he did need the suit? He was now upstanding, mentally and physically frozen, really, his eyes touched with a stony glaze for the moment. He must get out of here. He must go back there at once and dispose of that suit, drop it in the lake, hide it somewhere in those woods beyond the house. And yet he could not do that so swiftly either, leave so instantly after this light conversation about the drowning of those 2 people. How would that look? And as instantly there came the thought, no, be calm. Show no trace of excitement of any kind if you can manage it. Appear cool. Make some unimportant remark if you can. And so, now mustering what nervous strength he had, and drawing near to Sandra, he said, "Too bad, eh?" Yet in a voice that for all its thinly achieved normality was on the borderline of shaking and trembling, his knees and his hands also. "Yes, it certainly is," replied Sandra, turning to him alone now. "I always hate to hear of anything like that, don't you?" Mother worries so about Stuart and me fooling around these lakes as it is."
"Yes, I know."
His voice was thick and heavy. He could scarcely form the words. They were smothered, choked. His lips tightened to a thinner white line than before. His face grew paler still. "Why, what's the matter, Clydie?" Sandra asked of a sudden, looking at him more closely. "You look so pale. Your eyes. Anything wrong? Aren't you feeling well tonight, or is it this light out here?" She turned to look at some of the others in order to make sure, then back at him, and he, feeling the extreme importance of looking anything but the way she was describing him, now drew himself up as best he could and replied,
"Oh, no, it must be the light, I guess. Sure, it's the light. I had a hard day yesterday, that's all. I shouldn't have come over tonight, I suppose."
And then, achieving the weirdest and most impossible of smiles, and Sandra gazing most sympathetically, adding, "Was he so tired, my Clydie mighty boy, after his work yesterday? Why didn't my baby boy tell me that this morning, instead of doing all that we did today? Want me to get Frank to run you down to the Cranstons now? Or maybe you'd like to go up in his room and lie down. He won't mind, I know. Shall I ask him?" She turned as if to speak to Frank, but Clyde, all but panic-stricken by this latest suggestion, and yet angling for an excuse to leave, exclaimed earnestly and yet shakily,
"Please, please don't, darling. I don't want you to. I'll be all right. I'll go up after a bit if I want to, or maybe home a little early if you're going after a while, but not now. I'm not feeling as good as I should, but I'll be all right."
Sandra, because of his strained, and as she now fancied almost peevish tone, desisted with, "All right, honey, all right. But if you don't feel well, I wish you'd let me get Frank to take you down or go upstairs. He won't mind. And then after a while, about 10:30, I'll excuse myself, and you can go down with me to your place. I'll take you there before I go home, and whoever else wants to go. Won't my baby boy do something like that?"
And Clyde said, "Well, I think I'll go up and get a drink anyhow,"
and disappearing in one of the spacious baths of the Harriet home, locking the door and sitting down and thinking of Roberta's body recovered, of the possibilities of a bruise of some kind, of the possibility of the print of his own feet in the mud and sandy loam of the shore, of that suit over at the Cranstons, the men in the wood, Roberta's bag, hat, and coat, his own liningless hat left on the water, and wondering what next to do, how to act, how to talk, whether to go downstairs to Sandra now and persuade her to go, or whether to stay and suffer and agonize. And what would the morrow's papers reveal? What? And was it wise, in case there was any news which would make it look as though eventually he was to be sought after, or in any way connected with this, to go on that proposed camping trip tomorrow? Or wiser to run away from here? He had some money now. He could go to New York, Boston, New Orleans, where Ratterer was. But oh no, not where anyone knew him. Oh, God, the folly of all his planning in connection with all this to date. The flaws. Had he ever really planned it right from the start? Had he ever really imagined, for instance, that Roberta's body would be found in that deep water? And yet here it was, risen so soon, this first day, to testify against him. And although he'd signed as he had on those registers up there, was it not possible now, on account of those 3 men and that girl on that boat, for him to be traced? He must think, and get out of here as soon as possible, before anything really fatal in connection with that suit should happen. Growing momentarily weaker and more terrorized, he now decided to return to Sandra below, and say that he was really feeling quite sick, and that if she did not object, he would prefer to go home with her, if she could arrange it. And consequently, at 10:30, when the evening still had hours to go, Sandra announced to Burchard that she was not feeling well, and would he run her and Clyde and Jill down to her place, but that she would see them all on the morrow in time for the proposed departure for Bear Lake. And Clyde, though brooding as to whether this early leaving on his part was not another of those wretched errors which had seemed to mark every step of this desperate and murderous scheme so far, finally entering the swift launch and being raced to the Cranston Lodge in no time, and once there excusing himself to Burchard and Sandra, as nonchalantly and apologetically as might be, and then hurrying to his own room, only to find the suit as he'd left it. No least evidence that anyone had been there to disturb the serenity of his chamber. Just the same, nervously and suspiciously, he now took it out and tied it up, and then, waiting and listening for a silent moment at which to slip from the house unobserved, finally ambled out as though going for a short walk. And then by the shore of the lake, about a quarter of a mile distant from the house, seeking out a heavy stone and tying the suit to that, and then throwing it out into the water as far as his strength would permit, and then returning as silently and gloomily and nervously as he'd gone, and brooding as to what the morrow might reveal, and what, if any appeared to question him, he would say. Chapter 8. The morrow dawned after an all but sleepless night, harrowed by the most torturesome dreams in regard to Roberta, men who arrived to arrest him, and the hike, until at last he arose, his nerves and eyes aching. Then, venturing to come downstairs about an hour later, he saw Frederick, the chauffeur who'd driven him out the day before, getting one of the cars out, and thereupon instructing him to bring all the morning Albany and Utica papers. And about 9:30, when he returned, proceeding to his room with them, where, locking the door and spreading one of the papers before him, he was immediately confronted by the startling headlines: "Mystery in Girl's Death. Body found yesterday in Adirondack Lake. Man companion missing." And at once, strained and white, he sat down in one of the chairs near the window and began to read. Bridgeburg, New York, July 9th. The body of an unknown girl, presumably the wife of a young man who registered first on Wednesday morning at Grass Lake Inn, Grass Lake, New York, as Carl Graham and wife, and later, Thursday noon, at Big Bittern Lodge, Big Bittern, as Clifford Golden and wife, was taken from the waters of the south end of Big Bittern just before noon yesterday. Because of an upturned boat, as well as a man's straw hat found floating on the water in Moon Cove, dredging with hooks and lines has been going on all morning. Up to 7 o'clock last evening, however, the body of the man had not as yet been recovered, and according to Coroner Height of Bridgeburg, who by 2 o'clock had been summoned to the scene of the tragedy, it was not considered at all likely that it would be. Several marks and abrasions found upon the dead girl's head and face, as well as the testimony of 3 men who arrived on the scene while the search was still on, and testified to having met a young man who answered to the description of Golden or Graham in the woods to the south of the lake the night before, caused many to conclude that a murder had been committed, and that the murderer was seeking to make his escape. The girl's brown leather traveling bag, as well as a hat and coat belonging to her, were left, the bag in the ticket agent's room at Gun Lodge, which is the railway station 5 miles east of Big Bittern, and the hat and coat in the coat room of the inn at the lake, whereas Graham or Golden is said to have taken his suitcase with him into the boat. According to the innkeeper at Big Bittern, the couple on their arrival registered as Clifford Golden and wife of Albany. They remained in the inn but a few minutes before Golden walked to the boat landing just outside and procured a light boat in which, accompanied by the girl and his suitcase, he went out on the lake. They did not return, and yesterday morning the boat was found bottom side up in what is known as Moon Cove, a small bay or extension at the extreme south end of the lake, from the waters of which soon afterwards the body of the young woman was recovered. As there are no known rocks in the lake at that point, and the wounds upon the face are quite marked, suspicion was at once aroused that the girl might have been unfairly dealt with. This, together with the testimony of the 3 men, as well as the fact that a man's straw hat found nearby contained no lining or other method of identification, has caused Coroner Height to assert that unless the body of the man is found, he will assume that murder has been committed. Golden or Graham, as described by innkeepers and guests and guides at Grass Lake and Big Bittern, is not more than 24 or 25 years of age, slender, dark, and not more than 5 feet 8 or 9 inches tall. At the time he arrived, he was dressed in a light gray suit, tan shoes, and a straw hat, and carried a brown suitcase, to which was attached an umbrella and some other object, presumably a cane. The hat and coat left by the girl at the inn were of dark and light tan, respectively, her dress a dark blue. Notice has been sent to all railroad stations in this vicinity to be on the lookout for Golden or Graham,
in order that he may be arrested if he is alive and attempts to make his escape. The body of the drowned girl is to be removed to Bridgeburg, the county seat of this county, where an inquest is later to be held." In frozen silence he sat and pondered, for would not the news of such a dastardly murder as this now appeared to be, together with the fact that it had been committed in this immediate vicinity, stir up such marked excitement as to cause many, perhaps all, to scan all goers and comers everywhere in the hope of detecting the one who had thus been described? Might it not be better, therefore, since they were so close on his trail already, if he were to go to the authorities at Big Bittern or here and make a clean breast of all that had thus far occurred, the original plot and the reasons therefore, only explaining how at the very last he had not really killed her, had experienced a change of heart, and had not been able to do as he planned. But no, that would be to give away to Sandra and the Griffiths all that had been going on between him and Roberta, and before it was absolutely certain that all was ended for him here. And besides, would they believe him now, after that flight, those reported wounds? Did it not really look as though he'd killed her, regardless of how he might try to explain that he had not? It was not unlikely also that at least some among all those who had seen him would be able to detect him from this printed description, even though he no longer wore the grey suit or the straw hat. God! They were looking for him, or rather for that Clifford Golden or Carl Graham who looked like him, in order to charge him with murder. But if he looked exactly like Clifford Golden and those three men came, he began to shiver, and worse yet, a new and horrible thought this, and at this instant, and for the first time flashing upon his mind, the similarity of those initials to his own. He'd never thought of them in an unfavorable light before, but now he could see that they were detrimental. Why was it that he'd never thought of that before? Why was it? Why was it? Oh, God! Just then a telephone call for him came from Sandra. It was announced as from her, yet even so he was compelled to brace himself in order to make even an acceptable showing vocally. How was her sick boy this morning? Any better? How dreadful that illness last night to come on him so suddenly. Was he really all right now? And was he going to be able to go on the trip all right? That was fine. She'd been so frightened and so worried all night for fear that he might be too sick to want to go. But he was going, so everything was all right again now. Darling, precious baby. Did her baby boy love her so? She was just sure that the trip would do him a lot of good. But until noon now, dear, she would be using all her spare time getting ready. But at 1 or 1:30, everybody would be at the casino pier. And then, oh my, oh, for a great old time up there. He was to come with Bertine and Grant, and whoever else was coming from there, and then at the pier he could change to Stewart's launch. They were certain to have so much fun, just loads of it. But just now she would have to go. Bye-bye. And once more, like a bright-colored bird, she was gone. But 3 hours to wait before he could leave here, and so avoid the danger of encountering anyone who might be looking for Clifford Golden or Carl Graham. Still, until then, he could walk up the lake shore into the woods, couldn't he? Or sit below, his bag all packed, and watch who, if anybody, might approach along the winding path from the road or by the launch across the lake. And if he saw anyone who looked at all suspicious, he could take flight, could he not? And afterwards doing just that, first walking away into the woods and looking back as might a hunted animal, then later returning and sitting or walking, but always watching, watching. What man was that? What boat was that? Where was it going? Was it coming here by any chance? Who was in it? Supposing an officer, a detective. Then flight, of course, if there was still time. But at last 1 o'clock in the Cranston launch, with Bertine and Harley and Wynette, as well as Grant and himself, setting out for the pier, and once there joined by all who were going, together with the servants, and at Little Fish Inlet, 30 miles north on the eastern shore, they were met by the cars of the Baggots, Harriets, and others, from where, with their goods and canoes, they were portaged 40 miles east to Bear Lake, as lonely and as arresting almost as Big Bittern itself. The joy of this trip, if only that other thing were not hanging over him now. This exquisite pleasure of being near Sandra,
her eyes constantly telling him how much she cared, and her spirits flamed so high because of his presence here with her now. And yet Roberta's body up. That search for Clifford Golden, Carl Graham, his identical description wired as well as published everywhere. These others, all of them in their boats and cars, had probably read it. And yet, because of their familiarity with him and his connections, Sandra, the Griffiths, not suspecting him, not thinking of the description even. But if they should guess, the horror, the flight, the exposure, the police, the first to desert him, these, all save Sandra perhaps, and even she too. Yes, she, of course, the horror in her eyes. And then that evening at sundown on the west shore of this same lake, on an open sward that was as smooth as any well-kept lawn, the entire company settled in 5 different colored tents ranged about a fire like an Indian village, with cooks and servants' tents in the distance, and a half-dozen canoes beached like bright fish along the grassy shore of the lake, and then supper around an open fire, and Baggett and Harriet and Stewart and Grant, after furnishing music for the others to dance by, organizing by the flare of a large gasoline lamp a poker game, and the others joining in singing ribald camping and college songs, no one of which Clyde knew, yet in which he tried to join, and shouts of laughter, and bets as to who would be the first to catch the first fish, to shoot the first squirrel or partridge, to win the first race, and lastly solemn plans for moving the camp at least 10 miles farther east after breakfast on the morrow, where was an ideal beach, and where they would be within 5 miles of the Matisik Inn, and where they could dine and dance to their heart's content. And then the silence and the beauty of this camp at night, after all had presumably gone to bed, the stars, the mystic shadowy water faintly rippling in a light wind, the mystic shadowy pines conferring in the light breezes, the cries of night birds and owls, too disturbing to Clyde to be listened to with anything but inward distress. The wonder and glory of all this, if only he were not stalked after as by a skeleton, by the horror not only of what he'd done in connection with Roberta, but the danger and the power of the law that deemed him a murderer. And then Sandra, the others having gone to bed or off into the shadow, stealing out for a few last words and kisses under the stars, and he whispering to her how happy he was, how grateful for all her love and faith, and at one point almost tempted to ask whether, in case it should ever appear that he was not as good as she now seemed to imagine him, she would still love him a little, not hate him entirely, yet refraining for fear that after that exhibition of terror the preceding night, she might connect his present mood with that, or somehow with a horrible, destructive secret that was gnawing at his vitals. And then afterwards lying in the forecot tent with Baggett, Harriet, and Grant, listening nervously for hours for any prowling steps that might mean, God, what might they not mean even up here? The law, arrest, exposure, death, and waking twice in the night out of dread, destructive dreams, and feeling as though in fearing that he cried out in his sleep. But then the glory of the morning once more, with its rotund and yellow sun rising over the waters of the lake, and in a cove across the lake wild ducks paddling about. And after a time Grant and Stewart and Harley, half-clad and with guns and a great show of fowling skill, foolishly setting forth in canoes in the hope of bagging some of the game with long-distance shots, yet getting nothing to the merriment of all the others, and the boys and girls stealing out in bright-colored bathing suits and silken beach robes to the water, there to plunge gaily in and shout and clatter concerning the joy of it all. And breakfast at 9, with afterwards the gaiety and beauty of the bright flotilla of canoes making eastward along the southern lake shore, banjos, guitars, and mandolins strumming, and voices raised in song, jest, laughter. "Whatever matter, Wisdom Sweet, today? Face all dark. Can't a be happy out here with Sandra and all these nicey good baddies?" And Clyde is instantly realizing that he must pretend to be gay and carefree. And then Harley, Baggett, and Grant and Harriet at about noon announcing that there, just ahead, was the fine beach they had in mind, the Ram's Horn, a spit of land commanding from its highest point all the length and breadth of the lake. and with room on the shore below for all the tents and paraphernalia of the company. And then throughout this warm, pleasant Sunday afternoon, the usual program of activities: lunching, swimming, dancing, walking, card-playing, music, and Clyde and Sandra, like other couples, stealing off, Sandra with a mandolin, to a concealed rock far to the east of the camp, where in the shade of the pines they could lie, Sandra in Clyde's arms, and talk of the things they were certain to do later, even though, as she now announced, Mrs. Finchley was declaring that after this particular visit of Clyde's her daughter was to have nothing more to do with him in any such intimate social way as this particular trip gave opportunity for. He was too poor, too nondescript a relative of the Griffiths. It was so that Sandra yet in a more veiled way described her mother's talking, yet adding, "How ridiculous, sweetum! But don't you mind. I just laughed and agreed, because I don't want to aggravate her just now. But I did ask her how I was to avoid meeting you here or anywhere now, since you are as popular as you are. My sweetum is so good-looking. Everybody thinks so, even the boys." At this very hour, on the veranda of the Silver Inn at Sharon, District Attorney Mason, with his assistant Burton Burley, Coroner Height, and Earl Newcomb, and the redoubtable Sheriff Slack, paunched and scowling, yet genial enough in ordinary social intercourse, together with 3 assistants, first, second, and third deputies Crouch, Sissel, and Swank, conferring as to the best and most certain methods of immediate capture. "He's gone to Bear Lake. We must follow and trap him before news reaches him in any way that he's wanted." And so they set forth, this group, Burley and Earl Newcomb, about Sharon itself, in order to gather such additional data as they might in connection with Clyde's arrival and departure from here for the Cranstons on Friday, talking with and subpoenaing any such individuals as might throw any light on his movements. This book is continued on cassette number 3, side 1. Please fast forward to the end of this tape.